Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where history slows down, the lamps grow softer, and the world becomes just a little quieter for a while. Tonight we're setting out across salt water, old maps, creaking wooden decks, and a story so large that even the people inside it did not fully understand what they were doing until it was already done. This is the story of the first men to sail all the way around the world. Not in comfort, not with engines, not with weather reports, steel ships, radios, GPS, refrigerated food, or a cheerful little map on a screen telling them to turn slightly left in 3,000 miles. They sailed with canvas, rope, timber, stars, courage, fear, hunger, arguments, prayers, and a great deal of guessing, which, if we are being honest, is also how many people assemble flat-pack furniture, though usually with fewer oceans involved. Their voyage began in 1519, when 5 ships left Spain under the command of Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese sailor working for the Spanish crown. Their purpose was not to prove a point for school textbooks. It was not to make a neat line around a globe for a classroom wall. It was to find a western route to the Spice Islands, the rich and distant islands of Southeast Asia, where cloves, nutmeg and other precious spices grew. In that time, spices were not just things sprinkled gently into soup. They were wealth, medicine, status, trade, politics and ambition packed into small fragrant shapes. A sack of cloves could matter more to a merchant than a chest of silver. Pepper could move kings to sign papers. Nutmeg could make men look at an ocean and think, yes, perhaps we should cross that. And so they went. 5 ships. Around 240 to 270 men, depending on which account and list one follows, because even the numbers in this story seem to have been tossed about by weather and time. The ships were called Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago. Strong names, sturdy names, the sort of names that sound ready for history. But wood is still wood, rope is still rope, and an ocean does not become kinder simply because a ship has been given a confident title. Before we go any farther, I wonder where you are listening from tonight. Are you near the sea, or far inland where the nearest waves are only in memory or imagination? Are you hearing rain at the window, traffic outside, a quiet room, or perhaps the soft hum of a fan somewhere in the dark? And if you were standing on a dock in 1519, watching those ships pull away, would you have wanted to go with them, just to see what was beyond the known edge of the map? Or would you have stayed very sensibly on land with a warm meal, dry socks, and no immediate risk of scurvy? There is no shame in the second answer. In fact, history contains many great moments that are best admired from a safe distance, preferably with tea. If you find this journey calming, curious, or simply a pleasant way to let the day loosen its grip, I would be grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of history reach other people who might enjoy drifting through old stories without being shouted at by the internet, which is a surprisingly rare pleasure. And if you're already settled in, comfortable, and ready to wander for a while, then let your thoughts slow down. We are not rushing across the sea tonight. We are travelling at the pace of sail, tide, rumour and candlelight. The Magellan-Elcano expedition, as we now call it, lasted from 1519 to 1522. It began with Magellan, but it did not end with him. That is one of the important things to remember from the very start. Magellan is the name most often attached to this voyage, and for good reason. He planned it, argued for it, led it, and found the passage through South America that carried his ships into the Pacific Ocean. But Magellan did not live to return. He was killed in the Philippines in 1521, far from Spain, far from Portugal, and far from the beginning of the journey. The man who finally brought the last surviving ship home was Juan Sebastián Elcano, a Basque sailor who began the expedition in a lower position than Magellan, and ended it by completing one of the most astonishing voyages in human history. That detail gives the story a different shape. It is not a simple tale of one great man sailing neatly around the world while everyone else holds the ropes in the background. It is messier than that, and more human. It is a story of leadership and rivalry, of skill and luck, of hunger and discipline, of sailors who mutinied, sailors who died, sailors who deserted, sailors who kept going because turning back was sometimes more dangerous than continuing. It is about maps that were wrong, oceans that were larger than expected, and a world that turned out to be much bigger than many Europeans had imagined. Think for a moment about how ordinary the world feels to us now, in one very specific way. We know its shape. We may not always remember the capital of every country, and many of us would struggle to draw a perfectly accurate map from memory, especially if asked before breakfast. But we know that Earth is a globe. We know that oceans connect. We know that if a ship keeps going west and manages not to sink, it can eventually come back from the east. This knowledge sits quietly in our minds like furniture in a familiar room. We do not have to inspect it every day. It is simply there. For the sailors of the early 16th century, that certainty was not so comfortable. Educated Europeans did know the Earth was round. The old idea that everyone believed in a flat Earth, until one brave sailor corrected them, is one of those historical misunderstandings that refuses to sink, rather like a cork with a dramatic personality. Scholars, navigators and rulers had long understood the Earth as spherical. The real problem was not shape. The real problem was size, distance, politics, and the inconvenient habit of continents appearing where one hoped to find open water. The Portuguese had built a powerful route to Asia by sailing around Africa and across the Indian Ocean. Spain wanted another way. Under the Treaty of Tordesillas, Portugal and Spain had divided new overseas claims between themselves along an imagined line, because apparently one of the bold habits of empires is to draw lines across places full of people who are not invited to the meeting. Spain looked west. If there was a way through or around the lands across the Atlantic, then perhaps Spanish ships could reach the Spice Islands without using the Portuguese route. It was a commercial question, a political question, and a deeply practical question. How do you get to the other side of the world when another empire is standing beside the door you already know? Magellan believed there was a way. He had sailed in the Portuguese service before. He had experience in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. He had seen enough of the world to believe that the Spice Islands could be reached by sailing west, if only someone found the passage through the Americas. He was not wandering into this with the innocence of a daydreamer staring at a puddle and deciding it might lead to China. He was ambitious, informed, stubborn, and, by many accounts, not always easy to like. These qualities are not rare among people who try to change the map. They can be useful at sea and quite tiring at dinner. His own king in Portugal did not support his plan, so Magellan went to Spain and offered the idea to Charles I, the young Spanish king who would later become Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Imagine the nerve of that for a moment. A Portuguese navigator, rejected at home, walking into the service of Spain with a plan to reach the riches of Asia by sailing west through uncertain waters. It was bold, risky, and politically awkward. It also sounded profitable enough to be taken seriously, which has opened many royal doors throughout history. The expedition was approved, ships were prepared, men were recruited, supplies were loaded, barrels of food, wine, oil, vinegar, flour, beans, salted meat, cheese, fish, and other provisions went aboard. There were trade goods too, meant for exchange in distant places: cloth, mirrors, bells, knives, beads, metal items, and other objects that Europeans hoped would be useful when dealing with rulers and communities they did not yet know. Weapons were taken as well, because exploration in this age often arrived with a Bible in one hand, a ledger in another, and a cannon somewhere close by. The men who joined the fleet came from many places. There were Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, Frenchmen, Greeks, Germans, and others. Some were experienced sailors, some were officers, pilots, gunners, servants, craftsmen, and hopeful men chasing wages or adventure. One of the most important people aboard though he was not the commander, was Antonio Pigafetta, a Venetian gentleman who kept a detailed account of the voyage. Without his writing, much of what we know about the journey would be far thinner. He watched, listened, recorded, misunderstood some things, understood others, and survived to tell the story. Every dangerous expedition needs someone like that, though preferably someone who remembers where he put the ink during a storm. It is easy to picture the beginning of such a journey as grand and clean. Flags lifting in the wind, priests blessing the ships, families waving from the shore, the sun shining kindly on the river, a fleet slipping away toward glory. There may have been moments like that. History has a fondness for dramatic departures, but beneath the ceremony was a much more ordinary and uneasy truth. Many of these men were sailing into conditions they could not predict, under commanders they did not all trust, toward a route no one had successfully completed. Some surely felt excitement, others may have felt dread. Some were probably thinking mostly about wages. A few may already have regretted joining before Spain had fully disappeared behind them. There is something very human in that. Great events often begin with mixed feelings, sore feet, and someone quietly wondering if it is too late to get off. The world they left behind was not small, but it was still full of blanks on European maps. The Americas were not yet understood in their full size. The Pacific Ocean had been seen from the American side by Europeans only a few years earlier, when Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama in 1513 and looked upon what he called the South Sea. But seeing an ocean from a ridge of land is very different from crossing it. Anyone who has ever looked at a large lake and thought, "That does not seem so far," only to find themselves still paddling much later, with damp sleeves and a new respect for distance, will understand the problem in a very small way. The Pacific was not just another stretch of water waiting politely beyond South America. It was immense. Far larger than Magellan expected. Far larger than his crew could comfortably endure. They would enter it after losing ships, surviving cold, facing mutiny, and threading their way through a dangerous southern passage. Then they would sail for months without fresh food, without proper knowledge of where the next land might be, across an ocean so wide that it almost seemed designed to correct human confidence. That, however, was still ahead of them. At the beginning, there was Spain, the smell of tar and rope, the weight of supplies, the calls of men moving cargo, the slap of water against hulls, and the uneasy excitement that comes before leaving familiar ground. The fleet first departed from Seville, moving down the Guadalquivir River, and later sailed out from San Lucar de Barrameda toward the Atlantic. It is worth pausing on that movement downriver. The ships did not simply leap from Spain into legend. They eased away in stages. The great voyage often begins not with a sudden plunge but with a slow separation. First the dock is behind you, then the town, then the riverbanks, then the coast. Then one morning, or one evening, or one grey hour when the horizon is hard to read, land is gone. For the men aboard, that disappearance mattered. Land is more than a place to stand. It is fresh water, repairs, markets, churches, taverns, families, shade, news, and the chance to sleep without the floor moving under you. Once land slips away, the ship becomes everything. It is workplace, bedroom, prison, shelter, and hope. On a long voyage, a ship is not only a tool. It is the little wooden world that must keep the larger world from swallowing you. The fleet was not large by modern standards. A person used to today's cruise ships, cargo vessels, or naval ships might look at Magellan's ships and feel immediate concern. They were small wooden vessels built for the needs and limits of their age, and they had to carry men, provisions, trade goods, weapons, spare equipment, and the heavy uncertainty of the route itself. Space was cramped. Privacy was nearly impossible. Comfort was not really part of the design. The smell alone must have been memorable in ways best not explored too energetically before sleep. Daily life at sea was hard even when things went well. Sailors worked in watches. They handled lines, adjusted sails, pumped water, repaired damage, cleaned where they could, and ate food that grew worse as time passed. Fresh provisions did not stay fresh. Bread hardened or became infested. Water spoiled. Salted meat could become unpleasant enough to make hunger and disgust shake hands. Rats were not passengers anyone had invited, but they often came anyway, and unlike the sailors, they did not worry about discipline or royal orders. Navigation required skill and patience. Mariners used the sun, stars, compass, charts, dead reckoning, and experience. Latitude could be estimated more reliably than longitude, which remained a stubborn problem for centuries. A ship could know roughly how far north or south it was, but knowing exactly how far east or west was much harder. That meant long voyages carried a constant uncertainty. You could be moving across the ocean with confidence in your direction, and still be wrong about your position in a way that mattered very much. It is one thing to be slightly lost in a city with streetlights. It is another to be slightly lost in an ocean with empty barrels. Magellan had to manage not only distance and weather, but people. This may have been the hardest part. The fleet sailed under the Spanish crown, but Magellan was Portuguese. Some of the Spanish officers distrusted him. He in turn guarded his plans closely. A commander who does not explain himself may seem wise to himself and suspicious to everyone else. Tension was built into the voyage before the first great storm arrived. When men are tired, hungry, frightened and far from home, small resentments can ripen quickly. A ship at sea gives disagreement nowhere to spread out, so it circles, tightens and waits. Even the goal itself carried confusion. They were searching for a route to the Spice Islands by going west. That sounds simple enough when spoken in a calm room. In practice, it meant crossing the Atlantic, reaching the coast of South America, finding a hidden passage through or around a vast landmass, entering an ocean whose size they did not know, reaching Asia, trading or claiming success, and then somehow getting home. Each part contained enough danger for a full story of its own. Combined, they made a plan so difficult that calling it ambitious feels almost too polite. And yet, they sailed. This is one reason the story still holds our attention. It is not because every motive was noble. Many motives were not. Wealth, empire, competition, conversion, and personal glory all move through the voyage. The expedition was part of a wider age of European expansion that brought violence, disruption, and conquest to many places and peoples. A calm telling of the story does not need to sand those facts smooth. We can admire the endurance of the sailors and still notice the ambition of the empires behind them. We can be amazed by the navigation and still remember that the lands they reached were not empty spaces waiting for European names. They were home to communities with their own rulers, languages, trade networks, rivalries, knowledge and histories. That makes the voyage more complicated, not less interesting. It was not simply humanity meeting the planet. It was Europe pushing outward into worlds already alive with people. When Magellan's ships appeared on distant shores, the people watching from those shores were not background figures in a European adventure. They were participants in their own present, making choices, judging strangers, negotiating, resisting, welcoming, trading, and sometimes fighting. The sea connected these worlds, but it did not make them simple. The first circumnavigation was therefore not one clean triumph, but a chain of encounters and consequences. It changed maps, trade, politics, and imagination. It confirmed in practice that the oceans formed one connected system and that a ship could circle the globe. It showed Europeans the true scale of the Pacific, though at terrible human cost. It gave Spain a claim to achievement and knowledge. It gave later generations a story that would be told and retold, often with pieces missing, names enlarged, and uncomfortable details tucked away like clutter before guests arrive. At the centre of it all were men living one day at a time. That is easy to forget. We see the whole route now. We can trace it from Spain to South America, through the strait, across the Pacific, into the Philippines, to the Moluccas, across the Indian Ocean, around Africa and back to Spain. We can look at a map and see the loop. They could not. They lived it as uncertainty. One coastline, one storm, one shortage, one decision, one death, one repair, one sunrise, one more day. That is how most histories lived, really. Not as a finished map, but as a sequence of imperfect mornings. So tonight, as we begin, it may help to imagine not the whole globe at once, but a single ship preparing to leave. A sailor checks a rope, another carries a barrel. Someone argues over supplies, someone jokes too loudly to hide nerves. A priest says a blessing. An officer watches Magellan and wonders whether this Portuguese commander can be trusted. Pigafetta, curious and observant, prepares to witness more than he can yet imagine. Somewhere nearby, a man looks back toward land and thinks of home. Another looks forward and thinks of spices, wages, and stories he might one day tell. The tide moves, the sails wait, the order comes. And slowly, with all the ordinary noise of work and water, the fleet begins to move toward the Atlantic, toward South America, toward hunger, conflict, discovery, death, survival, and the first completed circle around the Earth. To understand why they went and why anyone thought this dangerous westward route was worth attempting, we need to step back into the world that made such a voyage seem not only possible, but necessary. A world of spice markets, rival kingdoms, old trade routes, new maps, and the powerful smell of cloves travelling farther than most people ever would. The smell of cloves could travel a very long way before the cloves themselves were ever seen. It could pass from hand to hand, port to port, market to market, tucked into sacks, locked in chests, weighed on scales, argued over by merchants, taxed by rulers, carried by sailors, and finally placed in kitchens, medicine boxes, churches, and wealthy homes across Europe. By the time a small dark clove reached a table in Spain or Portugal, it had already crossed a chain of human effort so long that almost no one at the end of it could picture the beginning clearly. And that beginning, for the spices that mattered most to Magellan's dream, lay far away in Southeast Asia, in the islands Europeans called the Moluccas, or the Spice Islands. These were not just dots on a map. They were real places, with people, rulers, rivalries, languages, trade connections, and long histories of their own. But to European merchants and kings in the early 16th century, they became almost mythical because of what grew there. Cloves were especially precious. Nutmeg and mace came from another small group of islands nearby. These spices were rare in Europe, and rarity has always had a strange effect on human behaviour. It can make a tiny dried flower bud seem worth crossing the world for. Today, we might reach into a kitchen cupboard, find a small jar of cloves, sniff it once, and then put it back because the recipe only needed a pinch. We might sprinkle cinnamon over porridge or add pepper to eggs with hardly a thought. But in the world Magellan knew, spices carried a weight that is hard to imagine from a modern supermarket aisle. They were used in food, of course, but also in medicines, perfumes, religious practices, and displays of wealth. They helped make preserved foods more tolerable, warmed drinks, scented rooms, and impressed guests. A noble household with access to expensive spices was not simply eating dinner. It was showing status. It was saying, in the quiet language of rich people everywhere, please notice that we can afford this. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, and other spices moved through trade networks that had existed long before Portuguese or Spanish ships entered the Indian Ocean. Asian, Arab, Persian, Indian, Malay, Chinese, and African merchants had carried goods across seas and deserts for centuries. The trade was old, complex, and highly organised. European buyers were latecomers at the far western end of the chain, and every hand that touched the goods along the way added cost. A spice might begin in an island forest and end in a European market at a price that had climbed higher with every stop. By the time it reached Venice, Lisbon, Seville, Antwerp, or another trading city, it had become not just a thing to smell or taste, but a little piece of global business. This mattered because Europe in Magellan's time was restless. Kings wanted wealth, merchants wanted direct access, sailors wanted employment, reward, or fame. Mapmakers wanted better information, priests wanted converts, nobles wanted titles. Everyone, it seemed, wanted something. Which is one reason the age produced so many voyages and so few relaxed afternoons. For a long time, the eastern routes to the spices were controlled through older networks, and increasingly for Western Europeans, through Portuguese power at sea. Portugal had spent much of the 15th century pushing farther down the west coast of Africa, learning winds, currents, coastlines and trade patterns. This was slow work. It was not one heroic leap, but decades of voyages, mistakes, deaths, profits and accumulated knowledge. Portuguese navigators rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern end of Africa, and in 1498 Vasco da Gama reached India by sea. That achievement changed the balance of trade. It gave Portugal a direct ocean route into the Indian Ocean world, and from there Portuguese ships and fortresses began to reshape the spice trade by force, diplomacy and commerce. Spain watched all this with great interest, and probably with the expression of someone watching a neighbour build a larger house. Spain had its own Western dream. Christopher Columbus had crossed the Atlantic in 1492, believing he could reach Asia by sailing west. He did not reach Asia, though he insisted for a long time that he had reached lands connected to it. Instead, his voyages opened sustained European contact with the Caribbean and the Americas, with enormous consequences for the people already living there. But for Spain's purposes, the central question remained unsettled. Was there a way through these lands? Could a ship sail west from Europe, pass beyond the Americas, and reach Asia from the other side? This question became tangled with law, religion, diplomacy, and ambition. In 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided newly claimed overseas territories between them along an imaginary line in the Atlantic. It was a bold arrangement, considering the fact that much of what was being divided was not known to Europeans in any detailed way, and was certainly not empty. But empires often begin with confident lines drawn by people sitting far from the places those lines will affect. Portugal received rights to lands east of the line, Spain received rights to lands west of it. The details were more complicated, and the world itself was not yet measured well enough to make the division simple, but the treaty shaped the political background of Magellan's voyage. The Spice Islands sat on the far side of the globe, and that created an extremely useful uncertainty. If the world was round, then a line drawn in the Atlantic must have an opposite side somewhere across the Earth. But where exactly did that opposite line fall? Were the Spice Islands in the Portuguese half of the world, or the Spanish half? The answer depended on distances that Europeans could not yet measure accurately. Longitude, that stubborn east-west measurement, was still a serious problem. Without precise clocks and reliable global measurements, a claim could be stretched by hope, mathematics, persuasion, and the sort of creative confidence that tends to appear whenever enormous profits are nearby. Magellan's proposal grew from this uncertainty. He believed, along with the cosmographer Rui Falero, that the Spice Islands could be reached by sailing west, and that they might fall within Spain's sphere under the treaty. This was not only a navigational idea, it was a legal argument, a commercial promise, and a political opportunity. If Spain could reach the Moluccas from the west, it could challenge Portugal's grip on the spice trade without openly using the Portuguese eastern route around Africa. It was a way of saying, very politely and with several ships, we believe the world may entitle us to some cloves. Magellan himself was a complicated person to carry such a plan. He was Portuguese by birth, and had served Portugal in Asia and Africa. He had seen parts of the maritime world that many Spanish officials knew only from reports. He had experience, and experience is a valuable thing when asking a king to fund a dangerous idea. But he had also fallen out of favour in Portugal. King Manuel I refused to support him. Whether because of politics, distrust, wounded pride, or doubts about the proposal, the Portuguese crown did not give Magellan the backing he wanted. So he did something that must have felt like betrayal to some Portuguese eyes. He turned to Spain. There is something almost uncomfortable about that decision. Not because changing employers is unusual. Sailors, pilots, soldiers, and experts often moved between courts and kingdoms. Knowledge travelled where payment and opportunity allowed. But Magellan was not offering Spain a small service. He was offering a route that could threaten Portuguese interest in Asia. He was bringing with him experience gained in Portuguese service and placing it before Spain's king. To Magellan, perhaps this was justice after being refused. To Spain, it was a chance. To Portugal, it was a provocation. History often depends on which side of the table is telling the story. The Spanish king, Charles I, was young, ambitious, and ruling a kingdom with growing overseas interests. He and his advisors did not approve Magellan's plan because it sounded romantic. Crowns rarely spend money because a sailor has a nice feeling about the horizon. They approved it because it promised access to wealth and a stronger claim in the global contest with Portugal. The expedition was granted authority to sail west, search for a passage through the Americas, and reach the Spice Islands. Magellan would command. Rui Falero was initially part of the plan, though he did not sail. Contracts were made, titles and shares were promised. The voyage began to move from talk to paperwork, and from paperwork to timber, rope, barrels, and men. Before ships could leave, a map had to exist at least in imagination. That sounds simple, but maps in Magellan's time were not the clean, complete objects we know today. They were working tools, arguments, guesses, records, and sometimes secrets. They showed what was known, what was believed, what was rumoured, and occasionally what someone hoped would be true. Coasts might be drawn from direct observation. Interiors might be empty or filled with names, drawings, and possibilities. Islands might appear in the wrong places. Straits might be assumed where no strait existed. Distances could be dangerously wrong. And yet maps were powerful. A line on a map could convince a ruler to fund a voyage. A blank space could invite a sailor forward. A wrongly placed coast could become a disaster. A name written in ink could give a kingdom confidence it had no right to feel. Maps did not merely describe the world, they encouraged people to act upon it. The question of a western passage through the Americas was one of the great temptations. Europeans had reached lands across the Atlantic, but they did not yet understand the full continental barrier. South America stretched far downward, and somewhere perhaps there was a way through. Some believed there might be a strait, others hoped the lands might end sooner than they did. Many underestimated the size of the ocean beyond. This is where the dream became dangerous. It was one thing to say the world was round. It was another to know how much water lay between one shore and another. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and saw the Pacific Ocean from the American side. Europeans called it the South Sea, because from Panama it lay to the south. This sighting confirmed that another great body of water existed beyond the American lands. But it did not tell anyone how to reach it by ship from the Atlantic, and it certainly did not reveal its full size. Imagine being told there is another room beyond a wall, but not being told where the door is, how thick the wall might be, or whether the room is the size of a pantry or a continent. Balboa had shown that the sea was there. Magellan wanted to find the door. The word Pacific would come later from Magellan's own experience, when, after the storms and cold of the Southern Passage, he found the next ocean calm enough to call it peaceful. It is one of history's more misleading names. The Pacific may have greeted him gently at first, but it was not small, simple, or merciful. At the time he planned the voyage, no European expedition had crossed it. No one in Spain could say with certainty how long it would take, what islands lay along the way, how much food would be needed. or how many men could survive it. There were ideas, there were calculations, there were hopes. Unfortunately, hope does not prevent biscuits from spoiling. The planning of the expedition required turning these hopes into material decisions. How many ships? How many men? How much food? What trade goods? What weapons? What tools? What spare sails, anchors, rope, pitch, wood, and iron? What gifts for foreign rulers? What instructions in case of disagreement? What authority would Magellan have over Spanish captains who already disliked taking orders from a Portuguese commander? A voyage can look noble on a map and become very fussy in a warehouse. Someone must count barrels. Someone must inspect timber. Someone must decide how much wine is enough for men who may be gone for years, and one suspects the answer from the sailors was always a bit more. The fleet that emerged from this preparation was not glamorous, in the way later paintings sometimes make it seem. The ships were practical, crowded, and vulnerable. The Trinidad was Magellan's flagship. The San Antonio was the largest. The Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago completed the fleet. Their names now sound famous because we know what followed. At the time, they were vessels that needed caulking, loading, staffing, and constant attention. Any ship is a compromise between ambition and physics. It must carry enough to survive, but not so much that it becomes slow, unstable, or impossible to manage. It must be strong enough to face weather, yet light enough to move. It must be repaired with what is available, often while the sea is trying to undo the repair. The men who joined were not all united by one dream. That is another comforting myth worth setting aside. Some may have been drawn by curiosity, some by wages, some by duty, some by pressure, some by the possibility of reward if the expedition succeeded. Some probably joined because life on land had not offered anything better. If few were gentlemen or officers, many were working sailors. There were specialists too, including pilots, gunners, carpenters, caulkers, priests, servants, and interpreters. The expedition needed hands as much as it needed courage. Great voyage is built from ordinary skills repeated under bad conditions. There were also tensions built into the command structure. Magellan had royal backing, but that did not make everyone loyal in their hearts. Several Spanish officers distrusted him, and some resented his authority. It is not hard to see why this mattered. Imagine being weeks or months from home, with no quick message to the king, no outside court of appeal, and your life depending on decisions made by a commander whose plans you suspect he is hiding. Now imagine all of this while sleeping badly, eating worse, and hearing the ship complain through every plank. Mutiny does not begin as a dramatic shout. It often begins as a quiet thought shared between tired men. The wider political situation added more pressure. Portugal had a reason to oppose the expedition. If Magellan succeeded, Spain could claim access to the spice trade from the west. Portuguese agents watched, objected, and may have tried to interfere. The preparations in Spain were therefore not simply a matter of loading ships. They were part of a contest between rival powers, each trying to turn geography into profit. The ocean looked open, but the politics around it were crowded. Still, beyond the ambition of kings and merchants, there was a genuine intellectual shift underway. The world was becoming measurable in new ways, not fully, not accurately enough, and not without terrible mistakes, but more than before. Reports from voyages were changing European understanding, coastlines were being added to charts, winds and currents were being learned. The Atlantic was becoming a travelled space rather than a terrifying western emptiness. The Indian Ocean, long familiar to Asian and Arab sailors, was being forced into Portuguese strategic plans. The Americas were altering every old assumption about what lay between Europe and Asia. It was a time when information was valuable enough to guard and incomplete enough to kill. The dream of the Spice Islands sat at the centre of this changing knowledge. Those small islands mattered because they connected taste, money, medicine, empire, and geography. They made rulers care about longitude. They made merchants care about monsoon winds. They made sailors care about islands they had never seen. They made map makers draw coastlines with more urgency. A clove was not only a spice, it was a reason to test the size of the earth. This may sound strange now, because we live in a world where goods move invisibly around us all the time. A package can cross continents while we complain that the tracking update is vague. Food from one hemisphere appears in another under bright supermarket lights. We are surrounded by global trade so constantly that it has become ordinary. But in Magellan's time, the supply chain was visible in risk. Every mile had to be crossed by bodies, ships, animals, carts, and human agreement. Every delay could ruin goods. Every storm could erase investment. Every ruler along a route could demand payment. Every pirate or privateer could turn trade into loss. The price of spice carried all that danger inside it. So when Magellan stood before Spanish authority with a plan to sail west, he was offering a shortcut through uncertainty. Not a shortcut in actual distance, as events would prove rather painfully, but a shortcut in control. If Spain could find its own route, it could avoid dependence on older routes and Portuguese power. It could reach the source. It could buy or claim directly. It could place Spanish flags, Spanish contracts, and Spanish influence where Portugal had already begun to build its own. That was the dream. Not simply discovery, but access. And maps helped make the dream feel possible. A globe could be turned by hand. A line could be traced west from Spain across the Atlantic. The coast of South America could be followed downward in ink. Somewhere near the lower edge, perhaps, the land would open. Beyond that, the South Sea. Beyond that, Asia. Beyond that, the islands of cloves. On a table by candlelight with the dangerous parts flattened into drawings, the plan might have seemed almost reasonable. This is one of the quiet tricks maps can play. They remove the cold. They remove the hunger. They remove the smell of bilge water and the sound of a mast straining in a storm. They make distance look obedient. But distance is not obedient. The men preparing to sail did not yet know how disobedient it would be. They did not know that one ship would be wrecked before the Pacific was ever reached. They did not know that another would desert and return to Spain. They did not know that hunger would drive men to eat things never meant for eating. They did not know that Magellan would die far from the spice markets he had promised to reach. They did not know that of the 5 ships, only one would complete the circle. They did not know that the Victoria, the small ship whose name now feels almost too fitting, would limp back with a fraction of the men who had left. At the beginning, all of that was still hidden by the future. What they had instead were reasons, spices, maps, rivalry, royal approval, personal ambition, the memory of Columbus, the sighting of the South Sea by Balboa, the Portuguese route around Africa, the Spanish desire for a Western claim, the belief that somewhere below the known coasts of South America there must be a passage, the hope that the ocean beyond would be manageable, the promise that cloves could repay the risk, the old human habit of thinking that because a thing can be imagined it may also be done. Perhaps that habit is dangerous. It certainly was here. But it is also one of the reasons history moves. Someone imagines a route. Someone doubts it. Someone funds it anyway. Someone loads barrels. Someone sharpens tools. Someone says goodbye. Someone steps onto a deck and does not yet know whether he is walking into fame, misery, or the last years of his life. By the summer of 1519, the dream had become solid enough to float. The ships gathered in Spain. Supplies were taken aboard. Orders were issued. Men settled into cramped spaces and uneasy hierarchies. The expedition was no longer only an argument about lines and islands. It was wood on water. It was rope under strain. It was food stored in darkness. It was officers watching one another carefully. It was sailors waiting for wind. And as the last preparations gave way to departure, the old maps could do no more than point. From that moment on, the fleet would have to learn from the sea itself, beginning with the Atlantic crossing and the long reach towards South America, where the search for a hidden passage would test not just Magellan's plan, but the patience and loyalty of every man who had agreed, wisely or otherwise, to follow him. By the time the fleet was ready to leave, the dream had already become uncomfortable. Dreams often look elegant from a distance. A western route to the Spice Islands, a new passage through the Americas, a Spanish claim to wealth that Portugal had tried to keep within its own reach, a line across the world that could turn cloves into royal revenue. On paper it had order. In a royal chamber it could be explained. On a map it could be traced by a finger. But on the river at Seville it became something else entirely. It became damp rope, stacked barrels, tired men, shouted orders, creaking hulls, suspicious officers, and ships that had to be made ready not for an idea but for the sea. The 5 vessels waiting under Magellan's command were not enormous, shining instruments of destiny. They were working ships, wooden, cramped, vulnerable, and heavily loaded. The Trinidad, Magellan's flagship, carried the authority of the voyage. The San Antonio was the largest, and in some ways the most important for supplies. The Concepcion, Victoria and Santiago completed the little fleet. Their names now have the sound of history about them, because we know what happened later. At the time, they were simply ships being prepared for a voyage no one aboard could properly measure. Imagine walking along the waterfront and seeing them before they left. Not as polished museum models, not as neat illustrations in a book, but as living pieces of wood and labour. Men moved back and forth with sacks and barrels. Coils of rope lay ready. Sails waited to be raised. The smell of pitch, river water, sweat, animals, food, and old timber mixed in the air. There would have been noise everywhere. Hammers, voices, footsteps, the slap of water, the low complaints of ships shifting with the river, and under all of it, the quiet pressure of departure. A voyage like this did not begin the moment land disappeared. It began in the heavy, awkward days when leaving became unavoidable. On August 10th, 1519, the fleet departed from Seville and moved down the Guadalquivir River towards Sanlúcar de Barrameda, near the mouth of the river. This was not yet the open sea. It was a slow movement from city to coast, from preparation toward commitment. The ships would remain at Sanlúcar for weeks while final work continued. That waiting mattered. It gave time for last supplies, last repairs, last instructions, and perhaps last doubts. It also gave everyone aboard plenty of opportunity to look at the water and think about how much of it lay ahead, which is not always helpful for morale. The men had not yet entered the great unknown, but already they were leaving normal life behind in stages. First the familiar streets of Seville, then the riverbanks, then the town at the mouth of the river, then, eventually, the open Atlantic. Each step loosened one more tie to home. This is how many great departures happen. Not all at once, with drums and perfect courage, but slowly, with paperwork, delays, repairs, and someone discovering that a barrel has been badly packed. The fleet finally sailed from Sanlúcar de Barrameda on September the 20th, 1519. Spain slipped behind them, though not instantly. Coasts do not vanish like candles being blown out. They shrink. Hills become lower. Buildings become pale marks. The shoreline thins into distance. Then at last there is only water and sky, and the men aboard must accept that the little wooden thing beneath their feet is now their world. For some, the departure may have felt thrilling. For others, it must have felt like a mistake that had become too public to undo. This was not a short trading run along a familiar coast. It was a royal expedition into uncertain waters, commanded by a Portuguese captain-general in the service of Spain, crewed by men from several nations, and already carrying mistrust in its hold as surely as it carried biscuit and wine. The sea ahead was not the only danger. The fleet itself was full of tension. Magellan was experienced, determined, and secretive. He knew more than many of the men beneath him, and he did not always tell them what he knew. There were reasons for that. A commander might keep plans close to avoid panic, protect strategy, or maintain authority. But secrecy at sea can grow mould almost as quickly as damp bread. The Spanish captains did not all trust him. Some resented his Portuguese birth. Some questioned his judgment. Some believed they had rank and dignity enough to be consulted more than they were. If a ship is a small world, then a fleet is a small society, and this society had already packed several future arguments before leaving Spain. The first stop was the Canary Islands. This was sensible. Ships often used the Canaries as a place to take on water, food, and other supplies before crossing the Atlantic. The island stood like a final European stepping stone before the ocean widened. There the fleet could make last adjustments, gather fresh provisions, and prepare for the long push west and south. For sailors, fresh food was not a luxury in the modern sense. It was health, strength, and time borrowed from future misery. Every vegetable taken aboard was a tiny act of optimism. At Tenerife, Magellan also received warnings. He learned that the Portuguese king had sent ships after him, and he was told of possible disloyalty among some of his own Castilian captains. That is not the sort of message one likes to receive before crossing an ocean. It is rather like being handed an umbrella and told, "By the way, the rain may be poisonous and your friends may have sold your shoes." Yet Magellan did not turn back. If anything, warning seemed to have made him more careful and more determined. When the fleet left the Canaries, it did not sail directly west in a simple line. Atlantic navigation required understanding winds and currents, and the best route was not always the one that looked shortest on a map. The ocean had habits. Sailors learned those habits through hard experience. Winds could help a ship along or hold it in place with maddening patience. Currents could carry a vessel where its crew did not intend to go. Clouds, stars, swells, birds, and floating plants all became clues. The sea spoke constantly, but not in a language that forgave lazy listeners. The men aboard settled into the pattern of ocean life. Watches changed, sails were adjusted, meals were served, repairs were made, water was rationed, officers measured, estimated, observed, and argued. Sailors climbed rigging, hauled lines, scraped, pumped, and obeyed. Days passed according to work, not comfort. A man slept when he could, ate what he was given, and learned the private moods of the ship under him. Every vessel makes its own sounds, and after long enough aboard, those sounds become familiar. A creak in one place is ordinary. A new crack somewhere else is a conversation nobody wants to have. Food began the voyage in better condition than it would later become. There were biscuits, flour, beans, lentils, oil, vinegar, salted meat, cheese, fish, wine, and water. Some fresh supplies from the Canaries would have brightened the early days, but everyone knew, at least in general terms, that fresh things do not stay fresh on a wooden ship crossing warm seas. Bread could become hard, damp, or infested. Water could turn foul. Salt meat could become an argument between hunger and the nose. Wine was safer than water in some cases, though not always helpful for discipline. Rats naturally had their own opinions about provisions, and they expressed them without permission. To our modern minds, the cramped conditions may be hard to picture properly. These ships were not floating hotels with charming wooden decor. They were packed with cargo, gear, animals in some cases, weapons, trade goods, and men who had to live almost on top of one another. Privacy was rare. Fresh air was not always fresh. Clothes became damp. Skin became irritated. Tempers shortened. A sailor could not simply go for a walk to clear his head unless he was prepared to walk in a very small circle while trying not to fall overboard. Still, the early Atlantic crossing had its calmer moments. The ocean was not always violent. There would have been days when the ships moved steadily, sails full, water sliding along the hulls, the fleet keeping company under a wide sky. Men might talk, mend clothing, sharpen knives, gamble quietly, sing, pray, complain, or stare at the horizon. Complaining, of course, is one of humanity's most reliable maritime traditions. ranking somewhere between knot tying and hoping the cook is in a good mood. For Antonio Pigafetta, the Venetian gentleman travelling with the expedition, these days were also an education. He watched and recorded. He noted places, events, people, animals, customs, dangers, and details that might otherwise have been lost. Pigafetta was not a neutral modern historian. He was a man of his time, with his own assumptions and misunderstandings. But he gave the voyage a voice that survived. Without him, much of this journey would reach us as scattered official records and later summaries. With him we have a closer view, sometimes strange, sometimes vivid, and often invaluable. As the fleet crossed the Atlantic, the men were moving not only across water, but out of one mental world and into another. Behind them lay Europe, with its courts, churches, markets, laws, rivalries, and familiar dangers. Ahead lay coasts known only in pieces to European navigators, communities with their own histories, and the great unresolved question of the passage. Every mile westward made the expedition less theoretical. The plan was no longer something Magellan had described to a king. It was now something all of them had to survive. The Atlantic itself was already a known ocean in 1519, but known does not mean safe. Portuguese and Spanish sailors had crossed and recrossed it, and Columbus had made his famous voyages decades earlier. There were established patterns, especially toward the Caribbean and Brazil. But any ocean crossing remained dangerous. A storm could scatter ships. Bad navigation could leave a crew searching for land that did not appear. Disease could begin quietly. A damaged mast or rudder could turn confidence into pleading. Even with experience, the sea kept the final vote. Magellan also had to think about the Portuguese. Portugal did not want this Spanish expedition to succeed. If Portuguese ships were sent to intercept him, then his fleet had to avoid them. This added urgency and secrecy to his choices. He did not simply sail across a neutral world of wind and water. He moved through a political landscape spread across the ocean. Rival kingdoms could not see each other over the horizon, but their ambitions travelled aboard ships. The command problems soon became clearer. Juan de Cartagena, captain of the San Antonio and a royal inspector, challenged Magellan's authority during the voyage. Cartagena held an important position, and he was not merely another officer with a sour expression. He represented Spanish interests aboard a fleet commanded by a man many considered foreign. The disagreement between him and Magellan was not just personal. It reflected the deeper unease of the expedition. Who truly commanded? How much authority did Magellan have? How much should the Spanish officers tolerate from him? In a comfortable office, such questions can be debated with documents. At sea, they can become dangerous very quickly. Magellan responded firmly. He could not allow open defiance to spread. A fleet crossing the ocean depends on hierarchy, especially when the destination is uncertain. If every major decision becomes a committee meeting on a rolling deck, nobody reaches the Spice Islands, though everyone may become very familiar with shouting. Cartagena was eventually arrested and removed from effective command, a sign that Magellan would not let his officers openly undermine him. But punishment does not always remove resentment. Sometimes it simply stores it for later, like a spark tucked into dry rope. The ships continued south and west. The air changed as they moved into warmer latitudes. The sky shifted. The stars at night looked different. For sailors, stars were not decoration. They were tools, guides, companions, and sometimes the only steady things in a world that rocked beneath them. The North Star, so useful in the Northern Hemisphere, sank lower as they travelled south. New stars appeared. The heavens themselves seemed to rearrange around the voyage. Imagine that quiet unease. Even the sky you trusted begins to change. Eventually the fleet reached the coast of Brazil, making landfall near what is now northeastern Brazil, before continuing down toward the Great Bay where Rio de Janeiro stands today. To Europeans aboard the ships, this was not empty wilderness, no matter how later stories sometimes describe such places. Indigenous peoples lived there, traded there, fought there, farmed, fished, travelled, and understood the coastline in ways the newcomers did not. The arrival of Magellan's ships was not the arrival of history itself. It was one moment in the lives of people who already had histories of their own. Early encounters along the Brazilian coast could be peaceful, curious, practical, and shaped by trade. Europeans had appeared in parts of Brazil before, especially Portuguese and French visitors involved in trade such as Brazil would. Some coastal peoples had experience with outsiders by the time Magellan arrived. This did not make the meeting simple, but it meant the strangers were not always as strange as they imagined themselves to be. Exchange could happen, food could be obtained, repairs could be made. Men who had spent weeks at sea could step onto land and feel, perhaps with great relief, that the earth still knew how to remain still. For sailors after an Atlantic crossing, land was a gift even when it was unfamiliar. Fresh food, fresh water, wood, rest, and trade could restore a crew. The body notices land before the mind has finished making judgments. Feet meet ground. The nose finds plants, smoke, soil, and cooking. The eyes rest from the hard line of the horizon. Men who had lived among barrels and rigging could see trees and running water. Even a difficult landing could feel like being handed back a small piece of ordinary life. The fleet stayed for a time in the region of Guanabara Bay. The place offered beauty, shelter, and supplies. It is easy to imagine the sailors staring at the landscape with wonder. Mountains, forest, water, heat, birds, and unfamiliar sounds surrounded them. After the disciplined discomfort of shipboard life, the coast must have seemed generous. But it was also a place of cultural meeting, misunderstanding, and unequal intentions. The Europeans wanted food, information, and advantage. The local people had their own reasons to trade or interact. Each side watched the other through its own expectations. There is a temptation in old voyage stories to make landfalls feel like pauses between the real events at sea. A fleet crosses the ocean, stops somewhere to gather supplies, then continues. But for the people living where the ships arrived, these were not pauses, these were encounters. Strange vessels appeared. Foreign men came ashore with metal goods, weapons, gestures, diseases they may not have understood, and demands they had not yet fully expressed. The history of exploration is often written from the deck looking toward land. It is worth occasionally turning the view around and imagining the shore looking back. Magellan's concern, however, remained the route south. Brazil was not the goal. The Spice Islands lay beyond the unknown passage, and the passage would not be found by lingering where food was pleasant and land was warm. The fleet had to continue along the coast of South America, searching for the opening that would lead to the other sea. Every bay, river mouth, inlet, and break in the land might raise hope. Was this the way through? Was this the passage? Or was it another false lead, another indentation in a coastline that seemed to go on and on? This search required patience, and patience at sea is not a gentle virtue. It is work. It is watching, sounding depths, sending boats, reading currents, comparing what the eye sees with what the map suggests, and accepting disappointment over and over again. South America did not politely label the entrance to the Pacific. The land stretched southward, and the fleet had to follow. As they moved down the coast, the weather would become less forgiving. The warmth of Brazil would give way eventually to colder waters and harsher conditions. The men did not yet know how far south they would have to go. They did not know that winter would catch them near the bottom of the continent. They did not know how mutiny would break open when fear and distrust sharpened. But the signs were already present. A difficult commander, resentful officers, a route with no certainty, ships that needed maintenance, men who had begun to understand that the voyage was not going to be quick. There must have been moments when some looked back mentally towards Spain and felt the distance grow heavy. At first, home is only weeks behind you, then months. News cannot catch up. Family voices become memory. Familiar streets begin to feel like scenes from another life. The expedition's world narrowed to ships, coast, weather, orders, and the next decision. A man might still dream of wages, spices, or glory, but daily survival has a way of pushing grand ambitions into the background. It is hard to think about global trade while trying to keep your bedding dry, and yet the fleet kept moving. That is one of the quiet facts of the voyage. Before the great discoveries and disasters, before the Strait in the Pacific, before Magellan's death and Elcano's return, there was this long persistence. Days of sail, days of watching the coastline, days of ordinary labour, days when nothing famous happened, but the voyage either continued or failed. History tends to remember the dramatic points because they're easy to mark. Departure, mutiny, passage, death, return. But between those points lay the work that made them possible. The 5 ships had left Spain as a fleet with a single purpose, but already the voyage had begun to change them. The Atlantic had tested discipline. The Canaries had brought warnings. Brazil had offered relief. South America now drew them onward into uncertainty. They were no longer simply leaving Europe. They were entering the long edge of the unknown, where every mile south made the maps less reliable and the stakes more immediate. From the deck, the coastline may have seemed endless. Forested shores, river mouths, lowlands, distant hills, changing weather, strange birds, unfamiliar waters. Somewhere beyond all of it, Magellan believed there was a passage. Not a symbol, not a dream. A real channel through land and water that would carry them to the sea Balboa had seen from Panama. But belief does not shorten a coastline. It does not calm a crew. It does not warm a southern wind. So the fleet sailed on, 5 ships still together, though not for much longer in the way they had begun. The easy part of the voyage, if anything about such a journey can be called easy, was already behind them. Spain was gone. The Atlantic had been crossed. The first landfalls had been made. Now the continent itself became the question, and the ships turned farther south toward colder skies, longer nights, rougher seas, and the slow-building unrest that would soon test Magellan more severely than any royal council ever had. South America did not give up its secret easily. The fleet had followed the coastline with the stubborn care of men searching for a hidden door in a very large wall. Every opening in the land invited hope. Every river mouth seemed, for a moment, as though it might widen into the long-awaited passage. Then it would turn shallow or narrow, or reveal itself as only another bay, another inlet, another place where the continent seemed almost to be teasing them. Magellan could not afford to ignore these possibilities. If he passed the strait by mistake, the whole voyage might fail, but each inspection took time, and time at sea was never empty. It consumed food, patience, rope, wood, health, and the fragile willingness of men to keep obeying. They came to the Rio de la Plata, a vast estuary so wide that it could tempt almost anyone into believing it might be the opening they sought. Fresh water flowed out into the sea. The land spread apart. The horizon offered room for imagination. Here, perhaps, was the passage. Here, perhaps, the ships could turn west and cross through the body of the continent toward the South Sea. It was a reasonable hope, and like many reasonable hopes in this voyage, it disappointed them. They probed the estuary and found no way through. That disappointment mattered. The Rio de la Plata was not a small false lead. It was enormous, promising, and wrong. The men had to accept that the continent continued. So the fleet moved south again, into colder waters and rougher weather. The warmth of Brazil faded behind them. The coast grew harsher. The days changed. The air felt different. A voyage that had already been long began to feel longer in a new way. It was no longer just a crossing. It was a search against the shape of the earth. At first, perhaps the southern coast offered a kind of hard beauty. There were open spaces, wide skies, wind moving over land and water, and unfamiliar shorelines that seemed far removed from the crowded ports of Spain. But beauty is not always useful when supplies are limited and the weather is turning. A sailor can admire a cold horizon for only so long before he begins to wonder what is for dinner, whether the rigging will hold, and why the man in charge has not found this famous passage yet. By late March of 1520, the fleet had reached a point where continuing south in worsening weather became too dangerous. The southern hemisphere was moving into winter. For men from Europe, following the sun downward into the wrong season must have felt strange enough. They had left Spain with summer behind them and sailed into a world where the calendar seemed to have turned against expectation. The further south they went, the colder and more difficult the conditions became. Winds sharpened, seas grew more threatening. The coastline offered fewer easy comforts. The ships were tired, and so were the men. On March 31st, they found a natural harbour. Magellan named it Port St. Julian. At first it must have looked like relief. A harbour meant shelter. Shelter meant repairs, rest, water, hunting, fishing, and a chance to stop fighting the sea every hour of the day. The ships anchored in the bay, and for the first time in a long while the men could imagine staying in one place. That sounds peaceful, but it was not simple. Stopping also meant admitting that the search would pause. It meant the fleet would remain in a cold, remote harbour for the winter, far from Spain, far from the Spice Islands, far from any certain knowledge of the route ahead. Magellan decided they would wait there until spring. It was sensible. It may even have been necessary. But sensible decisions are not always popular decisions, especially among men who are tired, suspicious, and beginning to fear that their commander has led them to the edge of nowhere. To Magellan, wintering at Port St. Julian was a way to preserve the fleet. To many of the men, it may have felt like being trapped. They had already sailed far enough to feel the danger of the undertaking, but not far enough to see proof that the plan was sound. They had not found the passage, they had not reached the South Sea, they had not earned riches or glory. They were sitting in a bleak harbour at the bottom of a continent, with cold wind outside and uncertainty inside the ships. This is the kind of situation that turns doubt into action. The tensions that had followed the expedition from Spain now hardened. Some of the Spanish captains had never trusted Magellan. His Portuguese birth remained a source of resentment. His secrecy made things worse. He did not freely share his full plans, and to men already inclined to mistrust him, that secrecy looked less like leadership and more like danger. They could say, with some reason, that he was risking the fleet. He could say, with some reason, that they did not understand what the expedition required. Both sides were standing on the same cold shore, but they were not seeing the same voyage. The mutiny came at Easter. It began in the night when Juan de Cartagena, Gaspar de Quesada, and Luis de Mendoza moved against Magellan's authority. They and their supporters took control of several ships, including the San Antonio, Concepcion, and Victoria. For a dangerous moment, Magellan controlled only the Trinidad and had the loyalty of the Santiago. 3 ships against 2 is not a small problem when those ships are armed and sitting close together in a remote harbour. A fleet meant to find a passage around the world was suddenly at risk of destroying itself without moving another mile. There is something almost strange about mutiny when viewed from a distance. We know the great story, the ocean crossing, the Strait, the Pacific, the eventual return of the Victoria. We know the voyage will continue, at least in part, but the men in Port St. Julian did not know that. For them, the mutiny was not a dramatic episode tucked safely into a future book. It was immediate, practical, and deadly serious. If the mutineers succeeded, they might turn back. If Magellan succeeded, the punishment could be severe. Everyone had to choose, or at least avoid being crushed by the choices of others. Magellan's response was quick and hard. He did not have the advantage in numbers of ships, but he did have resolve, loyal men, and the ability to act before the mutiny settled into a stronger position. He sent men to the Victoria, where Luis de Mendoza was killed. Control of that ship shifted back toward Magellan. The balance changed. The mutiny began to fail. Gaspar de Quesada was captured. Juan de Cartagena, already a repeated challenge to Magellan's authority, was also taken. The rebel hold over the fleet broke apart. The punishments that followed were harsh, though not unusual for the age and the stakes. Quesada was executed. Mendoza, already dead, was dishonoured after death in a public punishment meant to send a message. Cartagena was not executed at once, but his fate would become one of the darker and quieter punishments of the voyage. Later, he and a priest, Pedro Sanchez de la Reina, were left behind when the fleet departed. To be marooned in such a place was not a gentle mercy. It was a sentence carried out by distance, cold, and abandonment. For the men who remained, the message was clear. Magellan would not be overthrown. He would not turn back because his captains were afraid or angry. The voyage would continue when the season allowed it, but command won by force is still command under strain. The mutiny had been crushed, yet the underlying fears did not disappear. The men still did not know where the passage was. They still had to survive winter. They still had to ration supplies. They still had to repair ships in a remote harbour. The cold still came. The wind still worked its way into clothing and timber. The future remained as uncertain as before, only now it carried the memory of blood and punishment. One of the most difficult things about this part of the expedition is that it slows down. There is no grand movement across the globe here, no sudden discovery, no triumphant landing, just waiting. But waiting can be one of the hardest forms of endurance. The men at Port St. Julian were not resting in comfort. They were living through months of cold, reduced food, uneasy discipline, and fear of the unknown. Every day they stayed, their supplies changed. Every day they waited, the question remained. What if there is no passage? What if the world is too large? What if the commander is wrong? What if spring comes and the coast simply continues south until the ships break, or the men refuse? Winter turned the harbour into a test. The ships needed care. Wooden vessels left in hard conditions do not politely look after themselves. Hulls had to be inspected and repaired. Water had to be managed. Sails and rigging needed attention. The bilges had to be cleaned. Damage had to be fixed with whatever materials were available. Men put in chains after the mutiny were made to work. Labour became punishment, necessity, and survival all at once. A ship that cannot be maintained is not a ship for very long. It is only a future wreck with a crew still arguing aboard it. Food was another pressure. Magellan reduced rations to preserve supplies. That decision was logical, and it was probably resented immediately. Hunger has a way of making mathematics unpopular. A commander can explain that smaller portions now may keep everyone alive later, but the stomach is not easily impressed by long-term planning. Men who had already sailed far from home, who had seen no proof of success, and who now faced a cold winter in a strange harbour, had to accept less food under a leader some had recently tried to overthrow. This was not a recipe for cheerful loyalty. Around them was the land Europeans would call Patagonia. The name itself is tied to Magellan's voyage, though its exact meaning has been debated. The expedition encountered indigenous people in the region, likely Tehuelche or related groups, and Pigafetta wrote about them in terms that made them seem gigantic to European readers. The old stories of Patagonian giants would grow from such accounts. Like many travel tales, the reports mixed observation, exaggeration, misunderstanding, and the appetite of distant audiences for marvels. The people they met may well have been tall compared with many Europeans of the period, but they were not the impossible giants that later imaginations preferred. History is very good at adding height to a story when nobody nearby has a measuring stick. For the sailors at Port St. Julian, these encounters must have been remarkable. After so long aboard ship, after so much cold waiting, the sight of people living in that landscape with their own skills, tools, clothing, habits, and knowledge would have reminded them that they were not in an empty end of the world. Europeans often wrote as though they had reached remote wilderness, but the land was known to the people who lived there. The strangers were the ones who were lost. That reversal is worth keeping in mind. Magellan's men were trying to read the coast from ships. Local people understood the land through generations of use. They knew animals, weather, routes, seasons, and the practical facts of survival in ways the Europeans did not. Yet the expedition's records, like most European records of the period, tell the story mostly through European eyes. We hear more about what the sailors thought they saw than what the people of Patagonia thought of the sailors. Somewhere in that silence is another version of the story, one that was not written in Pigafetta's notebook. Magellan also made one of his more troubling decisions during this period. According to accounts of the voyage, he had 2 local men seized to be taken away. They did not survive the larger expedition. It is a small detail in some tellings, but it should not be passed over too softly. The age of exploration often wrapped violence inside curiosity. A desire to learn about people could become a decision to capture them. A wish to show proof back in Europe could treat human beings as evidence. The voyage around the world was an achievement of navigation and endurance, but it also belonged to an era that repeatedly turned encounter into possession. Still, within the fleet, the day-to-day question remained survival. The winter months at Port St. Julian were long. Imagine the cold mornings, men waking stiff in cramped spaces, the smell of damp wood, old food, smoke, tar, and unwashed bodies, the sound of wind passing over the harbour, work beginning because work had to begin, repairs, cleaning, guard duty, hunting or gathering where possible, watching the officers, watching the weather, watching Magellan. That last part mattered. A commander in such conditions becomes a living argument. Every decision is inspected. If he speaks little, men call him secretive. If he speaks firmly, they call him harsh. If he waits, they call him afraid. If he moves, they call him reckless. Magellan had chosen to winter, and the choice may have saved the fleet from worse weather. But the longer the wait continued, the more everyone had time to revisit their doubts. Time can calm fear, but it can also feed it, especially when there is nothing else to chew on. To learn more about the coast ahead, Magellan sent the Santiago south under Juan Serrano to scout for the passage. This was sensible and risky. The Santiago was the smallest of the fleet, and a smaller ship could explore more easily in some waters, but it was also vulnerable. Serrano found the Santa Cruz River, a place that offered shelter, fresh water, fish, wood, and other resources. For a moment this looked like good news. The expedition had found a better place to support itself while waiting out the season. Then the weather changed. As the Santiago tried to return, a storm caught her. The ship was driven onto a sandbar and wrecked. The men aboard managed to get ashore, which was a mercy, but the ship itself was lost. From 5 ships, the expedition was reduced to 4 before the passage had even been found. That loss must have struck the fleet deeply. A ship was not just a piece of equipment, it was storage, shelter, mobility, and a portion of the expedition's chances. Every ship carried men, supplies, tools, and options. Lose one, and the whole plan tightens. There is less room for error, less cargo space, fewer boats to scout and support one another, fewer ways to survive if another disaster comes. The Santiago had gone out to find hope and returned as wreckage. The survival of her crew was still a remarkable part of the story. Some of the men made the hard overland trip back to Port St. Julian to bring news of the wreck. They arrived exhausted. Magellan sent a rescue party, and the remaining survivors were recovered. It is worth pausing over that effort. In the middle of a hard winter, after mutiny, punishment, rationing and fear, men still marched overland to save other men. The expedition was full of ambition and cruelty, but also moments of duty and endurance. History rarely gives us one clean moral shape. It gives us people doing hard things, sometimes badly, sometimes bravely, often both in the same week. The wreck of the Santiago also changed the fleet's sense of the coast. The The sea to the south had proved dangerous, but Santa Cruz had resources. After months at Port St. Julian, Magellan eventually moved the remaining ships there. It offered better conditions for the final part of winter, and it placed the fleet farther along the route when the search resumed. That movement itself must have felt like a release. After being trapped in the same harbour for so long, even a short relocation could remind the men that the expedition was not dead. The ships could still move, the search could continue, the passage, if it existed, might still be ahead. But the cost of winter remained. The mutiny had revealed how close the fleet had come to breaking from within. The execution and marooning had left scars. The Santiago was gone. Supplies had been consumed. Men had learned that the southern coast could destroy a ship without ceremony. The passage had still not been found. And beyond the passage, if they ever found it, waited an ocean no European ship had crossed. That is the strange thing about this stage of the voyage. So much had happened, and yet the greatest hardships were still ahead. The fleet had already faced rebellion, cold, storms, hunger, and loss. Any one of those might have been enough to send another expedition home, but Magellan's goal remained fixed. He had not come to South America to explore politely and retreat. He had come to find the opening to the South Sea. He believed it was there, somewhere along the southern edge of the continent, and belief in a leader can be either inspiring or exhausting depending on whether one has eaten recently. For the sailors, spring did not mean comfort. It meant movement back into danger. It meant leaving the relative shelter of winter quarters and returning to the coastline that had already disappointed them many times. It meant cold water, uncertain channels, and the constant chance of another wreck. But it also meant the possibility that waiting had not been useless. Somewhere south of Santa Cruz, the coast might finally open. Try to imagine one of those men standing on deck as the fleet prepared to continue. He has survived the Atlantic crossing, he has seen Brazil, he has sailed down the coast, he has endured winter in a remote harbour, he has watched officers rebel and be punished. He has heard of the Santiago breaking apart. He may have helped repair a hull, haul a rope, bury a memory, or ration food. He may no longer care about spices. He may no longer think much about glory. He may only want certainty. Either the passage is there or it is not. Either they will find it or they will continue south into ruin. But certainty is not given all at once. It comes slowly, through work. The ships left the long winter behind and continued along the coast, reduced now to 4 vessels: Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, and Victoria. The names remained, but the fleet was not the same fleet that had left Spain. It was harder, more damaged, more suspicious, and more experienced. It had learned that the voyage would take more than courage. It would take discipline, luck, and the ability to continue after every sensible part of the mind had begun suggesting a return to warmer places. The continent still stretched before them. The southern winds still had teeth. The men still watched for openings in the coast. Then, in October of 1520, after the winter, after the mutiny, after the wreck, after months of searching and waiting, the fleet came upon another inlet. It was not the first opening they had seen. It was not the first place that might have raised hope. Men who have been disappointed often become careful with hope, as if spending too much of it at once may leave them with none for later. But this one was different. The water ran inward between dark land and hard weather. The entrance did not quickly close into a river. It seemed to lead on. The ships would have to test it, slowly and carefully, because a wrong guess here could wreck them as surely as any storm. Magellan did not yet know that this was the passage he'd been seeking. The men did not yet know that they were about to enter one of the most important waterways in maritime history. They only knew that the coast had opened again, and that somewhere inside that opening might be the way through. The opening in the coast did not announce itself with certainty. It did not rise before them like a gate built for sailors, with a neat sign saying, "This way to the other ocean, please mind the rocks." It was water running inward between harsh land, under a sky that had already shown them enough cold and trouble to make every hope feel slightly suspicious. The men had seen openings before. They had followed broad water into disappointment. They had watched rivers pretend to be passages. They had spent months learning that South America was very good at looking as though it might end and then continuing calmly and inconveniently farther south. This inlet appeared near the southern tip of the continent, close to what Magellan named Cape Virgins. The date was October 21st, 1520. The fleet had been reduced to 4 ships after the wreck of the Santiago. Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion and Victoria now carried the remaining men, supplies and arguments. They had survived mutiny, winter, cold, and the wearing effect of uncertainty. So when the coast opened again, they did not simply cheer and sail straight in with flags snapping and everyone suddenly full of confidence. They approached with caution. The place looked promising, but promising places had already wasted a great deal of their time. Magellan ordered an investigation. This was practical seamanship, not drama. A narrow or unknown channel could be deadly. The ships were not light little boats that could turn around wherever they pleased. They were wooden vessels under sail, pushed by wind and current, vulnerable to hidden shoals, rocks and sudden weather. To enter blindly would have been like walking into a dark cellar, while carrying the family china and wearing shoes made of butter. Possible, perhaps, but not sensible. Boats were sent ahead. Crews sounded the depths, watched the movement of the water and looked for signs that this was not another river mouth. That distinction mattered. A river would carry fresh water outward and eventually close the hope. A strait would continue, salt and deep, through land toward another sea. The men were searching for evidence in wind, tide, current and coastline. The earth was not going to explain itself. It had to be read. There were signs that the water was deep. There were tides. There was movement that suggested connection to another great body of water. That must have stirred something in the men, even the most doubtful ones. After so many false leads, the idea that they might finally have found the passage would have felt almost dangerous to believe. Hope can be tiring when it has disappointed you often enough. Still, they entered. The passage that would later carry Magellan's name was not a simple corridor. It was a maze of water, mountains, islands, channels, bays, cliffs and sudden turns. The Strait of Magellan runs through the southern edge of South America, between the mainland and the large island now called Tierra del Fuego. It is a place of difficult weather and powerful scenery, though the men aboard those ships were probably more focused on survival than scenic appreciation. There are times in life when a mountain view is impressive, and times when it is mostly a reminder that you're very cold and may hit something. As the fleet moved inward, the landscape changed around them. The open sea gave way to enclosed waters. Land rose on both sides. The ships passed between dark shorelines, steep slopes, and channels that seemed to divide and divide again. Smoke from fires could be seen on the southern land, likely from indigenous peoples living there, and the Europeans gave that land the name Tierra del Fuego, land of fire. To the sailors, those flames must have looked eerie in the cold distance. To the people who made them, they were part of ordinary life, warmth, cooking, signalling, presence. One side saw mystery, the other side was simply living. It is worth staying with that for a moment. The strait was not empty. It was not waiting in silence for Europeans to discover it. The Calvesca, Selknam, Yagan, and other indigenous peoples of the far south knew these lands and waters in their own ways. They lived with the cold, the channels, the animals, and the weather. Their knowledge was practical, local, and deep. The Europeans entered the strait as strangers. They were the ones who did not understand the place. Their maps were thin. Their assumptions were heavy. Their ships were impressive to them, but the environment did not care how impressive anyone felt. For Magellan, the strait was the answer to years of planning, persuasion, and stubbornness. If it truly led to the South Sea, then he had done what he promised Spain he could do. He had found the Western Passage through the Americas, but even that success came with immediate difficulty. because finding a door is not the same as walking safely through it. The passage was long and confusing. It did not run straight. It split into branches. At various points, the fleet had to decide which way to go, and each decision carried risk. Choose the wrong channel, and they might waste days or become trapped. Choose badly enough, and a ship could be wrecked. Magellan handled the exploration carefully. He divided the ships at times, sending some ahead to scout different channels while others waited. This was necessary, but it also exposed the fleet to another danger. Separating ships in unknown waters always carried the risk that they might not find each other again. There were no radios, no flares in the modern sense, no satellite beacons, no calm voice from a control room saying, "Vessel 3, please confirm your location." There were signals, boats, flags, fires, guns, and agreed meeting points, all of them useful until weather, darkness, or human decision interfered. Inside the strait, the men would have experienced a strange mix of relief and tension. They were no longer fighting the open Atlantic in the same way, but the enclosed waters brought their own worries. Currents could be strong, winds could be sudden and unpredictable, funneled between landforms. A ship might be becalmed in one place and battered in another. Anchoring could be difficult. Finding fresh water and wood mattered. The cold remained. Every mile forward had to be earned. The scenery, if they had time to notice it, must have been unlike anything many of them had seen. High ridges, snow in places, dark forests, bare rock, and water stretching between channels. The southern world was not gentle, but it was magnificent in a severe way. It did not resemble the warm coasts of Brazil or the familiar ports of Spain. It felt remote even to men who had already sailed far. The ships crept through it like small moving rooms, carrying European ambition into a landscape that made ambition look rather small. Then came another blow from within the fleet. The San Antonio deserted. This was not a minor loss. The San Antonio was the largest ship and carried a significant share of the expedition's supplies. Its departure would hurt the voyage materially and psychologically. While exploring within the strait, the ship turned back toward the Atlantic under the influence of men who opposed continuing, including the pilot Esteban Gomez. The San Antonio returned to Spain, carrying not only supplies and men, but also accusations against Magellan. To those who deserted, perhaps the decision seemed like survival or justice. To Magellan, it was betrayal. To the remaining ships, it was a severe reduction in their chances. Imagine being aboard one of the other vessels and realizing the San Antonio was gone. Not wrecked by weather, not taken by enemies, gone by choice. The largest ship, with valuable stores, had turned back. That must have chilled the fleet more than the southern wind. It meant that even after surviving the mutiny at Port St. Julian, the expedition was still divided. Not everyone believed in Magellan. Not everyone was willing to keep following him into the unknown. Some men preferred the known hardships behind them to the unknown ones ahead. And honestly, from a very human point of view, one can understand the fear, even while recognizing the desertion as a serious act. The men had been gone from Spain for over a year. They had endured danger without reaching the Spice Islands. They had seen one ship wrecked. They had wintered in a cold harbour. They had watched rebellion punished harshly. Now they were inside a strange, difficult passage with no certainty of what lay beyond. Turning back was not cowardice in every mind. It may have looked like the first sensible idea anyone had offered in months. But Magellan did not turn back. With San Antonio gone, he still had Trinidad, Concepcion, and Victoria. 3 ships, fewer supplies, fewer men, less room for failure. Yet the passage still led onward. The water continued west. The signs grew stronger. The dream that had brought them from Spain was no longer only a line on a map. It was around them, between the cliffs and channels, under the hulls, pulling them through. This must have been one of the most tense and important stretches of the entire voyage, not because there was one dramatic battle or one single decisive storm, but because every day required patience under uncertainty. The ships advanced, stopped, scouted, regrouped, and advanced again. The men had to keep working while knowing that their stores were reduced. Magellan had to keep command while knowing that a major ship had abandoned him. The officers who remained had to decide whether continued obedience was wisdom or simply momentum. Somewhere inside all of this, the passage slowly proved itself. The fleet spent more than a month navigating the strait. More than a month to pass through the hidden doorway they had spent so long trying to find. More than a month of cold water, difficult steering, searching, waiting, and hoping each bend would not end in another disappointment. In a modern car, a person can become annoyed when a tunnel lasts more than a few minutes. These men spent weeks in a natural passage at the bottom of the world, trying to determine whether it led to an ocean no European ship had crossed. The name Magellan gave the passage was not originally the Strait of Magellan. He called it the Strait of All Saints, because the fleet entered around the time of All Saints' Day. Later, history attached his name to it. That is often how naming works. A person enters a place, gives it one name, later people give it another, and the people who already live nearby may have had names and meanings of their own, long before either European version arrived. Maps can carry memory, but they can also cover memory over. Inside the strait, one can imagine the men watching the sky for signs of weather, watching the shore for fire or movement, watching the water for depth, and watching one another for signs of fear. The ships were separated at times, and reunion after scouting would have brought relief. A sail appearing where expected could mean safety. A sail missing could mean delay, desertion, or wreck. In such conditions, the absence of a ship must have felt like a physical thing. Magellan pressed on because the evidence increasingly supported him. The water stayed salt. The channel continued. The tide suggested connection. The path, though difficult, did not close. After years of belief and months of bitter testing, the world was finally agreeing with him. Not kindly, not quickly, but enough. At last, near the western end of the strait, the waters opened. On November the 28th, 1520, the remaining ships emerged into the ocean beyond South America. Magellan had reached the South Sea from the Atlantic side. He had found the passage. The fleet that had left Spain with 5 ships now entered the next ocean with 3. There must have been a moment of silence, or at least a kind of inward pause, when the men understood what had happened. Behind them lay the Atlantic, South America, winter, mutiny, punishment, wreck, desertion, and the winding channel that had nearly swallowed their certainty. Ahead lay open water, not a bay, not a river, not another dead end, a vast ocean. Magellan named it the Pacific because after the hard weather of the strait, the sea before him seemed calm. The name means peaceful. It is a beautiful name, and also, considering what followed, rather optimistic. The Pacific would turn out to be so enormous that its calm surface became its own form of danger. A storm can terrify a crew in a day. A quiet ocean can starve a crew over months. Still, at that first sight, after the cold and trouble behind them, the calm water must have felt like mercy. It is hard to overstate the importance of that moment. Magellan had proven that there was a navigable passage through the southern end of the Americas. He had connected in European navigation the Atlantic with the great ocean Balboa had seen from Panama 7 years earlier. He had shown that the western route to Asia was not blocked entirely by the American continents. That discovery alone would have secured his place in maritime history, even if nothing else had happened. But of course, much else did happen. The men did not know the size of what lay ahead. This is the crucial point. They had found the door, but they did not know the size of the room beyond it. They believed they were closer to Asia than they really were. The calculations available to them underestimated the width of the Pacific. The Earth was known to be round, yes, but knowing the shape of the Earth is not the same as knowing the distances across its oceans. Magellan had opened the way to the greatest test of the voyage, without fully understanding how great that test would be. For the men aboard Trinidad, Concepcion and Victoria, the sight of open water may have brought relief first. The passage was real. Magellan had not led them south for nothing. The mutineers had been wrong about the basic point. The cold months had not been wasted. The wreck of the Santiago and the loss of the San Antonio had not stopped them. They had reached the other sea, but relief would have been mixed with fear. The fleet was smaller now. The supplies were reduced. They had no reliable knowledge of the islands ahead. They needed food, water and luck. They had passed through the doorway, but the next stage offered no nearby wall to follow. The coast, for all its dangers, had at least been visible. Now they would leave land behind again, and this time the ocean before them was not the familiar Atlantic with known routes and earlier crossings. It was a vast water world that Europeans had not crossed from east to west. To sail into it was to enter a blank not only on the map, but in experience. The strait had been difficult because it was narrow, cold, and confusing. The Pacific would be difficult because it was wide. Those are a different kind of fear. In a strait the land presses close. You worry about rocks, shoals, currents, sudden winds, and wrong turns. In an open ocean, the danger is space itself. Too much water, too much sameness, too much distance between one possible source of food and the next. A ship can be trapped not by walls, but by endless room. Magellan did not turn north along the coast as some later navigators might have done. He steered northwest, then west, searching for the route toward Asia. He chose a path that would take the ships across a huge empty stretch, without touching the many island groups that might have offered food and water had he known exactly where to find them. This was not foolishness in the simple sense, it was the result of limited knowledge. The Pacific did not come with helpful markings. It did not say, fresh water this way, coconuts slightly to port, please avoid starving. The ocean was vast and their information was thin. Before that hunger fully arrived, though, there was the achievement of the passage itself. The men had reason to feel that something extraordinary had happened. They had crossed from one known sea to another by a route Europeans had only hoped existed. The world had opened under their keels. Their 3 ships, worn and diminished, had done what 5 had set out to attempt. There is a quiet human detail here that is easy to miss. The men who emerged into the Pacific were not the same men who had left Spain. Some were dead, some had deserted, some had been punished, some had survived wreck, cold and hunger. The survivors had been shaped by the voyage already. Their trust had changed, their bodies had changed, their idea of distance had changed. They had begun with the hope of reaching spices. They now carried the knowledge that every stage of the voyage could take more than expected and cost more than promised. And yet, when the Pacific opened before them, the expedition did not stop to admire its own importance for very long. Ships at sea cannot live on historical significance. They need water, food, repairs, and direction. Magellan had found the doorway, but his task now became harder in a new way. He had to cross the ocean beyond it. The men may have looked at that calm water and felt for a brief while that the worst was behind them. After storms, mutiny, and the severe southern passage, a peaceful sea could seem like a blessing. The sails could fill. The ships could move with less strain. The air might soften. The violent coast could fall behind them. Perhaps some even allowed themselves to imagine that Asia was not so far now. Perhaps they thought the Spice Islands were approaching in the invisible distance, and that soon there would be land, trade, fresh food, reward, and eventually home. That is one of the painful ironies of the voyage. The Pacific did not look like an enemy. It did not roar at them at first. It spread wide and calm, and in that calm it hid its true scale. A quiet danger is still danger. A smooth sea can be a very large desert. Behind them, the strait narrowed back into the cold southern land. Ahead, the horizon opened in every direction. The 3 ships moved onward, smaller than before, carrying men who had found the passage and were about to learn that finding the way through the continent was only the beginning. The next test would not be a mutiny in a harbour or a storm in a channel. It would be the slow arithmetic of distance, hunger, thirst, sickness, and the terrible realization that the peaceful ocean seemed to have no end. At first, the ocean seemed almost kind. After the cold channels, hard winds, and close dark land of the strait, the open water ahead must have felt like a release. The ships moved out from the southern edge of the continent and entered a sea that looked calm enough to deserve the name Magellan gave it. The Pacific, the peaceful sea. For men who had spent weeks in twisting waterways, watched a ship desert, lost another to wreck, and carried the memory of mutiny in their minds, that calm may have felt like a reward. But calm water can be misleading. A storm tells you quickly that it means harm. It tears at the sails, throws water over the deck, cracks timber, shouts through the rigging, and makes even the most confident sailor reconsider every life choice that brought him to that particular patch of ocean. A calm sea is different. It can look harmless while quietly taking away everything that keeps men alive. It does not have to break a mast. It only has to stretch farther than the food lasts. Magellan's remaining ships, Trinidad, Concepcion, and Victoria, sailed into the Pacific at the end of November 1520. They had found the western side of South America, and that was a tremendous achievement. But achievement did not fill the barrels. It did not replace the supplies taken away by the San Antonio when that ship turned back. It did not restore the Santiago. It did not give them fresh bread, clean water, vegetables, fruit, or meat. The ships had crossed the doorway to the new ocean with fewer resources than anyone would have wanted, and with a dangerous misunderstanding still sitting quietly beneath the voyage. They did not know how large the Pacific was. That one fact shaped everything that followed. If Magellan had known the true width of the ocean, he might have planned differently, if planning differently was even possible with the maps and information he had. He believed Asia was closer. Many Europeans did. The Earth was understood to be round, but its oceans were not correctly measured in practice. The space between South America and the islands of Asia was not just wide. It was enormous. It was a blue distance large enough to turn confidence into hunger. The fleet did not sail straight west immediately. Magellan first followed the coast of South America northward for a time, staying near Chile until mid-December. The ships needed to reach better latitudes and catch favourable winds. Then he turned northwest and out into the open sea. The land fell away, and with it went the last reliable source of fresh water, food, wood, and shelter. Once again, the ships became their entire world. But this time, the world around them was larger and emptier than anything they had yet crossed. For several days, perhaps, the mood may still have been hopeful. The sea was calm, the ships were moving, the passage had been found. Men who had doubted Magellan could no longer say he had invented the strait from stubbornness and bad temper. He had been right about the door. Surely, they may have thought, he was right about what lay beyond it. Surely the islands of Asia could not be impossibly far. Surely after everything they had endured, the voyage would soon begin to give something back. Sailors are practical people, but they are still human. A person can know that danger remains and still feel comfort from one solved problem. They had wanted proof that the passage existed. Now they had it. The sails filled. The ships moved across a smooth ocean. The worst, some may have believed, was behind them. Then days became weeks. The horizon stayed empty. At sea, repetition can become its own hardship. A storm is frightening, but it gives the body something immediate to do. Haul this rope. Secure that sail. Pump water. Brace yourself. Pray if you have a free moment, which you probably do not. But endless calm and steady sailing across an empty ocean presses on the mind differently. Morning comes, and there is water. Noon comes, and there is water. Night comes, and the stars appear over water. The next morning, water again. No coast, no island, no smoke, no birds in numbers that promise land. Only the ship, the other ships if they remain in sight, and the large blue answer of nothing yet. Navigation continued, of course. The pilots watched the sun, stars, compass, wind and sea. They estimated position as best they could. But longitude was still beyond precise measurement. They could not know exactly how far they had gone east or west. Dead reckoning is useful, but it is also a polite way of saying that skilled people are making careful guesses and hoping the ocean has not secretly disagreed. Currents can push, winds can vary. A small error repeated over many days can become a large uncertainty. Still, they sailed. Food worsened, water worsened. The stores that had been merely unpleasant became terrible. The biscuit, which had once been bread for survival, decayed into powder, dirt, insects, and smell. It was not the sort of food that appears in heroic paintings, because painters are kind. Men ate it because hunger does not wait for dignity. They chewed what could be chewed. They swallowed what could be swallowed. They drank water that had gone bad in the barrels, thickened by time and contamination. It must have smelled foul before it reached the mouth, and yet they drank it because the alternative was worse. Pigafetta, who survived to record the voyage, described this crossing with the plain horror of someone who had seen what hunger does to standards. The men at Biscuit, reduced to dust and crawling with worms. They drank yellow, stinking water. They ate pieces of ox hide that had once covered parts of the rigging, soaking them in the sea and roasting them to make them barely edible. They ate sawdust. Rats, when they could be caught, became valuable food. A rat sold for a high price because in a starving ship even a rat could look like supper. This is one of those details that cuts through any romantic view of exploration. The first crossing of the Pacific by this expedition was not only a triumph of navigation, it was men scraping life from things not meant to sustain it. And then came sickness. Scurvy was not understood in the way we understand it now. The men did not know that the disease was caused by a lack of vitamin C. They did not know why fresh fruits and vegetables could prevent or cure it. They only knew the symptoms, and the symptoms were frightening. Gums swelled, teeth loosened, old wounds reopened, skin changed, weakness deepened, men became unable to work, pain entered ordinary movement. A sailor who could once climb, haul and stand watch might find himself lying helpless, his body failing for reasons no prayer or command could easily fix. Scurvy is a slow enemy. It does not arrive like a cannon shot. It grows from absence of fresh food, absence of knowledge, absence of land. It turns the body against itself, not because the body is weak, but because it has been denied what it needs for too long. On those ships in the middle of the Pacific, there was nowhere to go for oranges, lemons, greens, or anything fresh enough to restore what was being lost. The ocean was calm, the sky was wide, and men were dying. The numbers vary in accounts, but many men became sick, and a significant number died during the crossing. Each death aboard a small ship changes the atmosphere. The dead man was not a statistic to the others. He had eaten beside them, worked near them, complained with them, feared with them. Perhaps he had argued over water. Perhaps he had joked in better weeks. Perhaps he had once talked about what he would buy with his wages. Then he became a body to be dealt with at sea. A prayer, if one could be given. A lowering over the side. A moment of silence. Then work again, because the ship still needed hands. The Pacific did not seem to notice. That is one of the hard truths of ocean voyages. Human suffering can be immense, and the sea remains itself. It does not pause for grief. It does not shorten the distance because the crew is weak. It does not send land because men have earned it. The ships moved on through a calm so steady that it almost became cruel. The name Pacific must have begun to feel less like a blessing and more like a joke told by someone with a very poor sense of timing. There were signs that might have raised hope, and then taken it away. Birds, floating plants, changes in the water, small things that sailors had learned to read as possible hints of land. Sometimes they sighted islands but could not make a useful landing, or the islands were too small, too barren, too far off, or too difficult to reach. In January 1521, they saw land, likely one of the remote atolls of the Tuamotu region, but it did not provide the relief they needed. To see land and not be saved by it may be worse than seeing nothing at all. It is like smelling bread through a locked door. They continued. By February they crossed the equator. That should have meant progress, and it did. But progress is a thin comfort when nobody knows how much farther remains. The men had moved from the cold south into warmer waters, but warmth did not cure hunger. The sun could feel harsh. The water stores continued to decline in quality. The sick remained sick. The healthy became fewer, weaker, and more afraid of becoming the next man unable to stand. Magellan somehow stayed focused. Whatever his faults, and he had them, his determination in this crossing was extraordinary. He had found the strait. Now he had to find land in the west. Turning back was hardly possible in any practical sense. The route behind them was too long, supplies were too poor, and returning through the strait and down the coast would not magically create food. Their best chance, perhaps their only chance, was to keep going until the ocean finally offered an island large enough to matter. A commander in such conditions must become both leader and symbol. Men may blame him for the hunger, even if the true cause lies in limited knowledge and the size of the ocean. They may depend on him at the same time. If he shows doubt, their fear grows. If he shows certainty, they may resent him for not admitting what everyone feels. He must ration, discipline, decide, and endure the stares of men whose bodies are failing under his command. There is no comfortable version of leadership in a starving fleet. We should also remember the ships themselves. They were not passive containers. They had to be kept alive in their own way. Rigging needed attention. Hulls needed watching. Pumps had to work. Sails had to be repaired. Salt water, sun, wind, and constant use wore everything down. A ship crossing an ocean is always being undone slightly by the journey, and the crew must keep putting it back together. This is hard enough with healthy men. With scurvy, weakness, and hunger spreading through the fleet, every task became heavier. The 3 ships remained together through the crossing, which was itself no small accomplishment. Losing sight of one another in such a vast ocean could have meant permanent separation. The fleet was reduced, sick and hungry, but still a fleet. Trinidad, Concepcion and Victoria moved westward across water no European crew had crossed in this way before. Their progress was not graceful, it was not clean, it was survival one day at a time. Think of the sound aboard at night, the creak of timber, the slap of water against the hull, the low movement of men trying to rest, coughing, groaning, a whispered prayer, perhaps someone shifting in pain because swollen gums made sleep difficult. The sails above breathing with the wind, the stars overhead, sharp and indifferent. The other ship showing lights or shapes nearby, if the night allowed. Every man aboard carried his own private thoughts, and many of those thoughts must have gone home. Home becomes strange during a long voyage. At first it is a real place waiting behind you. Then it becomes a memory you visit inwardly. Then, perhaps, it becomes almost unreal. A street, a door, a mother, a wife, a child, a tavern. A field, a church bell, bread that did not crawl with insects, water that did not smell like punishment. These ordinary things must have grown enormous in the minds of starving men. The voyage promised spices and reward, but the body may have dreamed mostly of fresh food and still ground. The Pacific crossing lasted more than 3 months without fresh provisions. Pigafetta famously wrote that they went 3 months and 20 days without refreshment of fresh food. Think about that slowly. Not an inconvenient week, not a rough fortnight, month after month on shrinking stores, with sickness increasing and no certain land ahead. The distance itself became the trial. The ocean did not need to attack. It only had to continue, and continue it did. The ships passed through a part of the Pacific where they missed many island groups that might have saved them earlier. This was partly bad luck, partly routing, partly the vastness of the ocean. The Pacific is full of islands, but it is also full of enormous spaces between them. A small change in route can mean the difference between sighting land and sailing past emptiness for weeks. To the men aboard, that emptiness must have felt personal by the end, as if the world were withholding its edges. By early March 1521, the fleet was close to breaking. The men were exhausted, food was nearly gone, scurvy had done its work. The ships had crossed roughly 99 days since leaving the strait before obtaining fresh food at Guam. 99 days is a long time even when life is comfortable. 99 days on failing ships, with foul water, wormy biscuit, starvation food, disease, and uncertainty is something else entirely. It is difficult to imagine without making the mind step back for its own protection. Then land appeared. On March 6th, 1521, the fleet reached Guam in the Mariana Islands. For the men aboard, the sight must have been almost unreal. After so much empty water, a real island meant food, water, people, trees, canoes, smoke, and the possibility of survival. The world had an edge again. The ocean had finally stopped being everywhere. The arrival, however, was not simple or peaceful in the way the starving men might have wished. The Chamorro people of Guam came out in swift outrigger canoes. They were skilled seafarers in their own waters, moving with a confidence that must have impressed and perhaps unsettled the Europeans. To the Chamorro, these strange ships were new arrivals in a world of island exchange and maritime knowledge. To the Europeans, weakened and suspicious after months of suffering, every action could be misunderstood through fear and desperation. The encounter soon became tense. The Europeans believed items had been taken from the ships, including a small boat, and Magellan responded with violence. He sent men ashore, houses were burned, and people were killed. The islands were then given a European name tied to the accusation of theft, though that name reflects the view of the visitors rather than a fair understanding of Chamorro actions or customs. It is important not to let the expedition's hunger make us excuse everything it did. Suffering can explain behaviour without making it right. The men had endured terrible hardship, but the people of Guam had not caused that hardship. Still, the stop gave the fleet what it desperately needed: fresh food, water, relief. The sick had some chance to recover. The men could eat things that had not spent months rotting in a barrel. Imagine the shock of fresh nourishment after so long. Fruit, roots, fish, or other local foods would not have been merely pleasant. They would have felt almost medicinal before anyone understood the chemistry. The body knows what it has lacked even when the mind does not know the name for it. After Guam, the fleet did not remain long. Magellan's goal was still farther west. The Spice Islands remained ahead, and between Guam and those islands lay the next stage of the voyage. But the Pacific crossing had changed everything. The men had survived one of the most extreme ocean passages in recorded European navigation up to that time. They had proved brutally that the ocean beyond South America was vast beyond expectation. They had shown that the world was larger not in theory, but in hunger, sickness, and time. The voyage had begun as a search for a route. Now it had become evidence of scale. For Europe, the crossing would alter maps and imagination. The Pacific could no longer be treated as a manageable gap between the Americas and Asia. It was a world-spanning ocean. For the men aboard, that knowledge was not a scholarly insight. It was written into their bodies. It was in their loose teeth, their weakened muscles, their memories of foul water, their dead companions, and the relief of land after months of seeing none. The fleet left Guam and sailed west again, now toward islands that would draw Magellan into a different kind of story. No longer only the story of ocean distance, but of encounters, alliances, local politics, conversion, pride, misunderstanding, and a fatal decision on a beach. The ships were still moving toward the Spice Islands, but before they reached them, they would come to the Philippines, where Magellan would find friendship, influence, opportunity, and danger woven together so tightly that he would not escape them. The ships reached the western islands like men waking after a long illness. For months, the Pacific had given them almost nothing but distance. The men had crossed water so wide that it had changed the meaning of the voyage. They were no longer simply sailors on a royal expedition. They were survivors of an ocean that had taken their strength, their confidence, and many of their companions. Their bodies had been weakened by hunger and scurvy. Their supplies had turned foul, their ships had carried them onward, but only just. So when land returned, it was not simply a sight on the horizon. It was food, water, trees, people, smoke, and the possibility that the world had not become entirely sea. After leaving Guam, the remaining ships continued westward. The men had refreshed themselves as best they could, though not without violence and misunderstanding at that stop. They had taken on supplies, recovered some strength, and moved on. Magellan still had the Spice Islands in mind, but the route now passed through an island world that Europeans did not properly know. These were not empty stepping stones placed conveniently for foreign ships. They were inhabited places with their own rulers, alliances, rivalries, customs, trade, and politics. The expedition was moving into a region of human complexity, not simply a patch of land after an ocean. On March 16th, 1521, the fleet sighted land in what would later be known to Europeans as the Philippines. More specifically, they came first to the island of Homonhon, near Samar. For the men aboard, the sight of trees and land after such suffering must have been a deep relief. Homonhon offered a place to rest and recover. They could get fresh water, they could find food, they could breathe, at least for a little while, without counting every rotten mouthful. Try to imagine the condition of the fleet as it arrived. Trinidad, Concepcion and Victoria were still afloat, but they had crossed one of the hardest stretches of the voyage. The men were thinner, slower, and marked by sickness. The ships themselves needed care. Ropes, sails, hulls, barrels, weapons, tools, and everything else aboard had been worn by salt, sun, and use. A ship after a long crossing is not simply a ship that has arrived. It is a list of things waiting to break. The islands, by contrast, offered life. Fresh food matters in a way that is difficult to understand until it has been absent. A small amount of fruit, fish, coconut, rice, or other fresh provisions could feel like restoration. Water that did not stink in a barrel could seem almost luxurious. Green land after months of blue emptiness would have rested the eyes. Even the air must have felt different. Land has smells that the open sea cannot provide. Plants, soil, cooking, smoke, animals, people. The body notices these things before the mind turns them into words. Magellan did not rush immediately into conquest or trade at full speed. The fleet needed recovery. Men had to heal enough to continue. Contacts had to be made. Information had to be gathered. They were far from Spain and far from any European base. In these waters, they were not the masters of the situation simply because they had guns and ships. They were newcomers, dependent on local knowledge, local food, and local decisions. That is an important fact. European accounts often place the newcomers at the centre of events, but in practice Magellan's men were vulnerable guests in a world they did not understand. One of the people who became especially important here was Enrique, often called Enrique of Malacca. He had been enslaved by Magellan years earlier in Southeast Asia and served as an interpreter. His presence matters because he could communicate in parts of the region in ways the Europeans could not. When the expedition reached island Southeast Asia, Enrique was far closer to home than almost anyone else aboard. His story is one of the most striking and complicated in the entire voyage. Some have suggested that if he had come originally from somewhere in this broad region, and had travelled west with Magellan before returning east with the expedition, he may have completed a form of circumnavigation before the surviving Spaniards did. The exact details of his origins and movements remain debated, but his position in the story reminds us that the first circle around the world was not only a European achievement, it also moved through the life of an enslaved man whose own journey is harder to recover because the records were not written for him. The fleet moved from Homonhon toward other islands and made contact with local rulers. One important stop was at an island often identified in the accounts as Mazawa, where they were received by local leaders and where Magellan's men gathered more information about the region. From there, they learned of Cebu, a larger and more powerful centre of trade and authority. Cebu was not a lonely island village waiting for meaning to arrive from Europe. It was connected to regional trade networks. Its ruler, Raja Humabon, had power, interests, rivals, and reasons of his own to deal with these foreign arrivals. When Magellan sailed into Cebu in April 1521, he entered a political world already in motion. This is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple meeting between Europeans and islanders. Magellan wanted supplies, friendship, trade, and perhaps influence. He also carried religious aims and a desire to bring local rulers into alliance with Spain and Christianity. Humabon had his own concerns. A ruler does not welcome armed strangers out of simple politeness. He measures them. He asks what they can offer, whom they might help against rivals, what dangers they bring, and how they can be fitted into existing relationships of power. It seems that Magellan and Humabon formed a close alliance. Gifts were exchanged. Ceremonies took place. Blood compact rituals are reported in later summaries of the encounter, and the Europeans interpreted these acts through their own ideas of loyalty and submission. The local meaning may not have matched the European meaning exactly. That is one of the common problems in first contact situations. Two sides can perform the same gesture and believe it has done different things. One side may think, we have made friendship. Another may think, we have created obligation. Another may think, we have accepted a temporary alliance. Another may think we have received subjects. History often grows dangerous in these mismatched spaces. Magellan's religious mission became central in Cebu. Humabon, his wife, and many people in Cebu accepted baptism. Pigafetta describes large numbers being baptized, and the event became an important moment in later Philippine Christian history. Humabon was given the Christian name Carlos after the Spanish king, and his wife was given the name Juana. Magellan gave her an image of the Christ child, later associated with the Santo Niño of Cebu. For the Europeans, this was a major success. They saw conversion, alliance, and royal influence arriving together. After months of survival, Magellan must have felt that the voyage had entered a new and promising stage. But success can be dangerous when it makes a man overconfident. Magellan had found the strait. He had crossed the Pacific. He had reached islands in Asia. He had made an alliance with a local ruler and witnessed conversions that, from his point of view, confirmed both his authority and his mission. It would be easy to understand how his confidence grew. After so much hardship, he may have felt that events were finally bending in his favour. The problem was that he had entered local politics without fully understanding them, and local politics can be as treacherous as any reef. Humabon had rivals and neighbouring leaders who did not necessarily accept his authority. One of them was Lapu-Lapu of Mactan, an island near Cebu. Lapu-Lapu refused to submit to Humabon or to Magellan's demands. Another Mactan leader, Zula, appears in Pigafetta's account as someone seeking Magellan's help against Lapu-Lapu. Whatever the exact local dynamics, Magellan chose to intervene. He would go to Mactan and use force to compel obedience. This decision changed the voyage. From a distance of 500 years, it is easy to ask why he did it. Why would Magellan risk himself and his men in a local conflict when the Spice Islands, the original goal, were still ahead? Why not avoid the fight, gather supplies, continue west, and leave the politics of Mactan to the people of Mactan? The answer likely lies in a mixture of confidence, religious zeal, alliance obligations, misunderstanding, and the desire to demonstrate power. Magellan may have believed that a quick show of force would strengthen Humabon, frighten opponents, and prove the superiority of Spanish arms. He may have thought the battle would be small and controlled. He may have believed too strongly in the authority he imagined he now held. The details matter. Magellan did not bring all the strength he could have brought. According to Pigafetta, he refused offers of large-scale assistance from local allies, or at least did not use them in the way one might expect. He seems to have wanted Europeans to demonstrate their power directly. That choice might have made sense if the goal was intimidation. It made much less sense if the enemy did not agree to be intimidated. In the early morning of April 27, 1521, Magellan and a group of armed men went to Mactan. The approach itself was difficult. The ships could not come close to shore because of shallow water and reefs. This meant the men had to wade a long distance through the water before reaching the beach. That detail is easy to pass over, but it mattered greatly. Armour, weapons, and wet clothing are not helpful when one has to move slowly through shallow water under enemy observation. The Europeans could not use their ship's artillery effectively from a close position. Their advantage was reduced before the fighting properly began. It is one thing to carry European weapons, it is another to bring them to bear in the wrong place. Lapu-Lapu's warriors were ready. They knew the ground. They knew the shallows. They understood where the foreigners would have to land. They were not passive targets waiting to be frightened by armour and crossbows. They used numbers, mobility, distance, and local knowledge. Pigafetta reports that they attacked with arrows, spears, stones, and other weapons, and that they aimed at the Europeans' exposed legs when they saw armour protecting other parts of the body. This is not the behaviour of people stunned by European presence. It is the behaviour of fighters adapting quickly and intelligently to what stood before them. The battle did not go as Magellan expected. The Europeans set fire to houses, perhaps hoping to frighten the defenders or punish resistance. Instead, it seems to have increased the anger of the opposing fighters. The attackers were outnumbered and increasingly pressed. The shallow water and distance from the ships made retreat difficult. The firearms and crossbows were less effective than Magellan likely hoped. The men began to fall back. In that retreat, Magellan stayed with a smaller group, covering others and trying to maintain order. Then he was wounded. Pigafetta's account describes Magellan being struck and surrounded. His helmet was knocked off. He was hit in the leg and arm. He fought on for a time, but the attackers closed around him. The men with him could not rescue him. Some were wounded, some retreated. The battle became a killing at close range, and Magellan died on the shore of Mactan. There is a strange stillness in that fact after so much movement. For years he had carried the idea of a western route. He had argued for it, crossed from Portugal to Spain, won royal support, commanded 5 ships across the Atlantic, survived mutiny, found the strait that now bears his name, crossed the largest ocean on Earth, and reached the islands of Southeast Asia. He had bent much of his life toward distance, and then he died not in a storm, not in the strait, not during the hunger of the Pacific, but in a local battle on a beach before reaching the Spice Islands. The expedition lost more than a commander. It lost the person whose authority, stubbornness, and personal vision had held the voyage together, sometimes harshly, but effectively enough to bring the ships this far. Many of the men had feared him, resented him, obeyed him, and depended on him. Now he was gone. His body was not recovered. Lapu-Lapu did not surrender it despite attempts to obtain it. The man who had crossed oceans disappeared into the outcome of a battle he had chosen. For the people of Mactan, the meaning was different. Lapu-Lapu had resisted the foreign commander and defeated him. In later Philippine memory, Lapu-Lapu would become a symbol of resistance against outside domination. That later national meaning came long after the event, but it rests on a real fact. Magellan's authority did not extend as far as he believed it did. On Mactan, local power held. European weapons did not guarantee victory. A commander who had forced a passage through a continent could still be stopped by people defending their own island. Back in Cebu, the surviving Europeans were shaken. The alliance with Humabon did not give them safety in the way they may have imagined. Magellan's death altered the balance immediately. The men who remained had to decide what to do without him, and they had to do it while still far from the Spice Islands, with fewer ships, reduced manpower, and uncertain relations with the people around them. The expedition had already been diminished by wreck, desertion, sickness, and hunger. Now it had lost its leader. There was also the matter of Enrique. Magellan's will reportedly promised freedom to Enrique after Magellan's death, but the surviving leaders did not honour that freedom as Enrique understood it. This created another fracture. Enrique had been valuable as an interpreter, and the Europeans needed him. But his own interests were not theirs. After Magellan's death, his position became dangerous and contested. The story of Enrique after this point becomes unclear, and different accounts leave gaps. What is clear is that the expedition was no longer held together by the same command structure, and people who had been forced into the voyage did not necessarily remain loyal once the force above them weakened. Soon after Magellan's death, the Europeans suffered another disaster in Cebu. Humabon invited several of them to a feast. The event turned violent, and many of the expedition's leaders and men were killed. Whether this was an act of betrayal, retaliation, political calculation, or a response to tensions the Europeans did not understand fully, it left the survivors in an even more desperate position. They fled to the ships. More men were gone. More authority had collapsed. The fleet that had once sailed under Magellan's firm command was now a damaged remnant trying to escape the consequences of alliances it had misread. It is hard not to see the Cebu and Mactan events as a turning point in the moral shape of the voyage. Until then, the expedition had faced the natural dangers of the sea and the internal dangers of command. Now it faced the human danger of entering other people's political worlds with too much confidence. Magellan had not simply discovered islands. He had tried to reorder relationships among them. He had used religion, alliance, and force together. For a brief moment, it looked as though he might succeed. Then Mactan proved otherwise. The surviving sailors now had a problem that was brutally practical. They no longer had enough men to operate 3 ships properly. The Concepcion, already worn by the voyage, could not be maintained with the reduced crew. So the decision was made to abandon and burn her. Another ship gone, not to storm, not to desertion, not to hidden rocks. This time, to lack of men. From 5 ships, the expedition was now reduced to 2, Trinidad and Victoria. Think of that reduction slowly. 5 ships left Spain. 1 wrecked in the south, 1 deserted in the strait, 1 burned in the islands because too few men remained to sail her. The commander was dead. Many officers were dead. The original plan had not been completed. The Spice Islands had not yet been reached. The survivors had crossed half the world and were still not safely on the road home. And still, the voyage continued. It did not continue because it was grand. It continued because the men were alive and had to choose a direction. They could not undo the Pacific. They could not bring Magellan back. They could not sail comfortably into certainty. They had ships, though fewer than before. They had knowledge, though not enough. They had wounds, debts, fear, and a mission that had become less like ambition and more like a narrow path between dangers. The islands had given them food after starvation, friendship after isolation, and then loss after confidence. They had shown the expedition that survival depended on more than seamanship. It depended on understanding people, and here the Europeans had often understood too little. They had entered alliances without fully grasping their obligations. They had mistaken conversion for control, local rivalry for simple disobedience, and military display for guaranteed victory. The price was Magellan's life and the further breaking of the fleet. With Trinidad and Victoria still afloat, the remaining men turned again toward the purpose that had first pulled the expedition from Spain, the Spice Islands. Somewhere to the southwest lay the Moluccas, the islands of cloves. Reaching them would no longer feel like the clean success Magellan had promised Charles I. It would feel like something dragged from disaster, something carried forward by men who had outlived the leader whose name would remain attached to the voyage. Among those survivors was Juan Sebastián Elcano, not yet the central figure in the story, but moving closer to the role that history would give him as the broken expedition searched for the spices it had crossed the world to find. By the time Juan Sebastián Elcano moved closer to the centre of the voyage, the expedition no longer looked like the grand fleet that had left Spain. It had become something smaller, stranger, and harder to define. 5 ships had sailed out with royal orders, full stores, crowded decks, and plans large enough to reach the far side of the world. Now only Trinidad and Victoria remained. The Santiago was gone in a storm on the southern coast. The San Antonio had deserted in the strait and returned to Spain. The Concepcion had been burned because there were no longer enough men to sail her. Magellan was dead at Mactan. Several leaders had been killed soon after in Cebu. Many sailors had died of hunger, scurvy, violence, and ordinary exhaustion turned deadly by distance. The expedition was still alive, but it was no longer held together by the man who had imagined it. That is a difficult moment in any journey. A plan can survive the loss of supplies. It can sometimes survive the loss of a ship. It can even survive fear, hunger, and mutiny if enough people continue to act in the same direction. But when the person who made the plan is gone, the survivors must decide whether the plan still belongs to them. They must ask, not in a formal meeting with clean papers and fresh candles, but on worn decks with damaged ships and missing friends, what now? Elcano had not begun the voyage as its great hero. He was a Basque mariner from Guetaria, experienced, capable, and practical. He had also been involved in the earlier mutiny at Port St. Julian, and Magellan had punished him, though not as severely as some others. That fact makes his later role more human and less tidy. History does not always hand its final task to the person who looked most promising at the beginning. Sometimes it chooses someone who has been flawed, punished, overlooked, or simply still standing when others are gone. By the time the survivors left the Philippines, they had no room for romantic ideas about easy victory. They needed to keep moving. They needed food, trade, leadership repairs, and a way to reach the Spice Islands. The purpose that had first pulled them from Spain still remained ahead of them. Cloves, the Moluccas, the small islands whose wealth had justified all the speeches, contracts, calculations, and risk. After everything they had endured, the expedition still had not reached the place it had been sent to find. So the 2 ships sailed on. The waters of Southeast Asia were not empty. They were part of a busy maritime world, crossed by traders, fishers, rulers, envoys, raiders, and travellers, long before these 2 battered European ships arrived. The sailors who remained under Spanish command were not entering a blank sea. They were entering a region with old roots and experienced local pilots, where knowledge of winds, reefs, islands, ports, and politics mattered more than any proud speech about royal authority. The Europeans had survived the Pacific, but here they needed guidance from people who knew where they were. After leaving the Philippines, the ships moved through a chain of islands and encounters that brought them farther into the region. They stopped at places in what is now Brunei and other parts of island Southeast Asia, sometimes trading, sometimes gathering information, sometimes becoming entangled in local tensions. It was not a simple line from disaster to triumph. It was more like a tired search through waters full of possibility and suspicion. They were close to the goal, but close is not the same as safe. A ship can be near the right island and still be ruined by a reef, a hostile encounter, a wrong wind, or one bad decision made by hungry men. The command structure shifted more than once after Magellan's death. Duarte Barbosa and Juan Cerro had briefly taken leading roles before they were killed in Cebu. Later, other officers held authority. Gonzalo Gómez de Espinosa became captain of Trinidad. Elcano eventually took command of Victoria. The names changed, but the problem stayed the same. The men needed to finish a voyage that had already consumed almost everything it was given. It is easy to imagine the atmosphere aboard those two ships as they moved westward. The men were not fresh explorers peering ahead with clean curiosity. They were survivors carrying months of fear in their bodies. They had learned that land could save them and endanger them in the same week. They had learned that alliances could turn deadly. They had learned that the sea could starve them while staying calm. They had learned that a commander could be right about the map and wrong about a battle. These lessons do not make a crew cheerful, but they can make it careful. At last, in November 1521, the ships reached the Moluccas. The goal was real. After the Atlantic crossing, the long coast of South America, the winter at Port St. Julian, the Strait, the Pacific, Guam, the Philippines, Mactan, Cebu, and all the deaths between, the men finally saw the islands that had pulled them across the world. They came to Tidor, one of the Spice Islands, where they were received by the local ruler. The cloves were not a rumour anymore. They were not a promise made to a king. They were not a line in a contract or a calculation in the mind of a cosmographer. They were there, growing in the world, handled by people who had known their value long before Europe's ships arrived. That must have been a strange moment for the survivors. Relief, certainly. Perhaps pride. Perhaps sorrow, too, because so many men who had sailed for this goal were no longer alive to see it. Magellan himself had died before reaching the islands he had promised to find. The fleet that finally arrived was not a triumphant armada, but two worn ships with depleted crews. Yet in practical terms, the expedition had done something remarkable. It had reached the Spice Islands by sailing west from Spain. Trade began. The ships took on cloves, the precious cargo that could make the voyage financially worthwhile if the cargo ever reached Spain. The smell of them must have filled the holds. After years of foul water, damp wood, spoiled food, sweat, smoke and sickness, the scent of cloves may have seemed almost unreal. Not gentle in the way we know it from a kitchen jar, but sharp, valuable and heavy with meaning. Every sack meant money. Every sack meant proof. Every sack meant that the expedition could return with something more than a story of suffering. There is a small but important difference between reaching the goal and completing the voyage. Many journeys fail after success because getting home is its own separate problem. The men had reached the Moluccas, but Spain lay on the far side of the world. Portugal controlled much of the eastern route. The ships were damaged. The crews were reduced. The food problem had not gone away. The world was round, yes, but that did not make it convenient. The original plan had not required a full circumnavigation in the simple way we now remember it. The aim was to reach the Spice Islands by sailing west. Returning home could be done in different ways, and the politics of the Treaty of Tordesillas made every direction sensitive. But the condition of the ships forced a decision. Trinidad, the old flagship, was in poor shape. She was leaking and needed repairs. Victoria, smaller and worn, was still capable of sailing. The commanders decided the ships would not leave together. Trinidad would remain behind for repairs and later attempt to return eastward across the Pacific toward the Americas. Victoria, under Elcano, would sail west, across the Indian Ocean and around Africa, trying to reach Spain by continuing in the same direction. That decision split the expedition's fate. Trinidad's attempt was heartbreaking. After repairs, she set out into the Pacific, trying to find a route back towards Spanish-held lands in the Americas. But the Pacific that had nearly destroyed the fleet before was not finished with them. The winds and conditions were against her. The ship struggled, men died, and she eventually had to turn back toward the Moluccas. There, the Portuguese captured the surviving crew. For Trinidad, the voyage ended in failure, imprisonment and dispersal. The flagship that had carried Magellan across so much of the world did not come home. Victoria became the last hope. On December 21st, 1521, she sailed from Tidore under Elcano's command. One ship, loaded with cloves carrying exhausted men, heading west across the Indian Ocean. It is worth slowing down over that image. There was no fleet now, no backup ship nearby, no second hull to carry extra supplies, no other captain to consult across the water. There was only Victoria, a small vessel that had already survived more than anyone had a right to expect, and a crew that knew very well how badly the sea could treat men. Elcano's decision was dangerous, but it was also practical. To get home, he had to avoid Portuguese power as much as possible. The Portuguese had forts, ships, and influence across the Indian Ocean and along the African route. If Victoria were caught, the cloves might be seized, the men imprisoned, and the expedition's achievements swallowed by imperial rivalry. So Elcano chose to sail a wide and difficult course across the Indian Ocean, avoiding known Portuguese ports where help might come with chains attached. Avoiding ports sounds simple until one remembers what ports are for. Ports mean water, food, repairs, news, medical help, such as it was, wood, rope, a place to stand. To avoid ports on a long ocean passage is to choose hardship in order to avoid capture. Victoria was not only sailing home, she was hiding across an ocean. The Indian Ocean had its own patterns, winds and dangers. Mariners in the region had understood seasonal monsoon systems for centuries, but the Europeans on Victoria did not have the freedom to move as ordinary traders did. They were carrying a valuable cargo through waters watched by rivals. They had to balance secrecy against survival. Too close to Portuguese routes, and they might be taken. Too far from help, and hunger or damage might finish them. It was a narrow kind of decision-making made on a very wide sea. The men aboard were already worn down. They had crossed the Pacific and survived the disasters in the Philippines. They had reached the Moluccas and loaded cloves. Now they had to face another immense passage. Imagine telling a sailor who had already endured the Pacific starvation that he must now cross another ocean without stopping at friendly ports. One suspects his reply would not be suitable for a bedtime narration, though perhaps it would be historically honest. The ship sailed across the Indian Ocean toward the Cape of Good Hope. This was not a calm homeward slide. The waters near the southern end of Africa were famously difficult. The Cape had earned its reputation among sailors because storms, currents, and winds could make rounding it miserable or deadly. For the Portuguese, the route around Africa had become established through decades of experience. For Elcano and the Victoria, it was a hostile doorway guarded not only by weather, but by the need to avoid Portuguese detection. As the weeks passed, food again became scarce. The cargo of cloves was valuable, but it could not feed the crew. A hold full of spices is very impressive until everyone aboard would rather have beans. The men faced hunger, exhaustion, and sickness once more. Some died. The survivors pushed on because stopping in the wrong place could ruin everything. The voyage home became a test of restraint as much as endurance. They had to keep sailing even when ordinary need told them to seek land. By May 1522, Victoria rounded the Cape of Good Hope. That alone was a major achievement, but it did not end the hardship. The ship was now in the Atlantic, the ocean that had first carried the fleet away from Spain almost 3 years earlier. In one sense, they had returned to familiar waters. In another sense, nothing was familiar anymore. The men aboard were few. The ship was damaged. The supplies were nearly gone. The route north was long. Portugal still remained a threat. The Atlantic must have felt different this time. On the outward voyage, it had been the first stage of ambition. Now it was the last stage of survival. The sailors were not looking toward a plan, but toward home. They had gone far enough west to come from the east. That fact is simple to say, and enormous to live. If they could keep the Victoria afloat and avoid capture, they would complete the first known circumnavigation of the Earth. But the body does not celebrate an achievement before it can eat. By July 1522, the condition aboard had become desperate. Men were dying of starvation. Elcano made the risky decision to stop at Cape Verde, a Portuguese-controlled island group, to obtain food. This was dangerous because the Portuguese were rivals and could seize them if they discovered where Victoria had been. The crew attempted to conceal the truth, presenting themselves as returning from the Americas rather than from the Spice Islands. At first, the deception worked. They were able to buy supplies. Then something strange happened with the date. The sailors had kept careful records, but when they reached Cape Verde, they learned that the local date was 1 day later than their own reckoning. They believed it was one date. The people at Cape Verde said it was the next. The reason, though not understood by them in modern terms, was that they had sailed westward around the globe and effectively lost a day relative to those who had not circled the Earth. This is one of those details that feels almost too neat for history, as if the planet itself had quietly stamped their papers. They had gone around the world so completely that even the calendar had noticed. The deception at Cape Verde did not last. The Portuguese discovered that Victoria carried spices from the East Indies. Several crew members who had gone ashore were detained. Elcano faced another hard choice: wait and risk the ship and cargo being seized, or leave the detained men behind and save what remained. He chose to escape. It was a severe decision, but the voyage was full of severe decisions by then. Victoria sailed away from Cape Verde with fewer men, leaving the detained crew behind. For those still aboard, the relief of fresh supplies was mixed with the guilt and fear of abandonment. For those left ashore, the voyage had nearly brought them home, then stopped under Portuguese guard. Circumnavigation, like many great achievements, did not distribute its glory evenly. From Cape Verde, Victoria continued north towards Spain. The last stretch must have felt unreal. After so long among unknown coasts and hostile distances, the waters leading home were near. Men who had survived 3 years of ocean and violence could perhaps begin to imagine the Guadalquivir again. Spain, Seville, bells, streets, bread, families, if they still waited, wages, if they were paid, explanations, if anyone could find words large enough. The Victoria arrived at Sanlúcar de Barrameda on September the 6th, 1522. Almost 3 years had passed since the fleet sailed from the same place. Of the 5 ships that had left, only this one returned. Of the roughly 240 to 270 men who began, only 18 Europeans came back aboard Victoria, along with a small number of men from the Moluccas. The numbers are stark. They do not need much decoration. 5 ships left. 1 came back. Hundreds departed. 18 of the original European survivors returned on the last ship. On September 8th, Victoria reached Seville. The ship must have looked terrible. Not like a symbol at first, but like an object that had barely remained itself. Worn hull, tired rigging, exhausted men, the smell of cloves, salt, sickness, and survival. The survivors reportedly went barefoot and carrying candles to give thanks, moving through the city after a voyage that had taken them around the earth. That image is powerful because it is not grand in the usual sense. It is not a parade of conquest. It is men who had been reduced by the journey, walking in gratitude because they were alive. Elcano had completed what Magellan began, though not in the way Magellan intended. He had not commanded the whole expedition. He had not found the strait. He had not led the Pacific crossing, but he brought the Victoria home. He made the final decision to continue west. He crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded Africa, escaped Cape Verde, and reached Spain with the proof of the voyage in his ship's hold. The clothes mattered financially, but the route mattered historically. The Earth had been circled by sea. It is understandable that Magellan's name became attached to the expedition. He conceived and led the voyage through its most famous discovery. Without him, there may have been no expedition. But it is equally important to remember Elcano. Without him, the surviving ship may not have completed the circle. The name Magellan stands at the beginning and middle of the story. Elcano stands at the return. The first circumnavigation was not the work of one man, but of many people, including those whose names were recorded, those whose names were lost, and those who helped or resisted the fleet in the islands and coasts along the way. The return also proved something that no argument could prove so forcefully. A ship had sailed west from Spain and returned from the east. The oceans were connected. The planet could be circled. The Pacific was far larger than expected. The Spice Islands could be reached by a western route, though the cost made the route far less practical than some had hoped. Knowledge had been gained, but it had been paid for in bodies, fear, violence, and years of suffering. For the survivors, the meaning was probably not as neat as it is for us. We can say first circumnavigation, global history, maritime achievement, expansion of geographical knowledge. They may have thought of food, pay, missing companions, and the simple fact that the ground no longer moved beneath them. A man who has crossed the world may still be most grateful for a bowl of something warm and a place to sleep where no one asks him to adjust a sail. Still, when Victoria came home, the voyage changed from an ordeal into evidence. Officials could inspect the cargo, writers could collect accounts, the surviving logbooks and testimonies could be compared. Pigafetta could tell the story. Elcano could receive honours, the crown could claim success, map makers could adjust the world. The old idea of the globe had now been carried through storms, hunger, and one thin ship returning with 18 men. And yet the return was not the full end of the story. The voyage's consequences spread outward after the ship reached Spain. The information it brought would shape future navigation, imperial competition, trade, and European ideas of the Earth's true size. The survivors had closed the circle in practice, but the meaning of that circle was only beginning to open. The world had not become smaller because they sailed around it. In many ways, it became larger, more connected, more contested, and much harder to misunderstand as a set of separate seas. The world had always been round, but now a ship had carried that truth back into harbour. That is the simplest way to say it. Those simple words do not quite hold the weight of what happened. Philosophers, astronomers, and educated people had known the Earth was a sphere long before Victoria returned to Spain. Magellan and Elcano did not discover that the planet was round in the way some old stories like to claim. That misunderstanding has wandered through classrooms and casual conversations for a long time, rather like a lost sailor who refuses to ask for directions. The real achievement was different, and in many ways more powerful. For the first time that we know of, human beings had sailed all the way around the Earth, and come home with direct proof that the oceans connected into one global system. One ship had made the circle, not a perfect circle of course. The route was uneven, full of delays, detours, mistakes, disasters, and decisions forced by weather, hunger, politics, and fear. It was not the neat line we see on modern maps. It was a path lived by men who did not know the shape of the next week, let alone the full curve of the voyage. But when Victoria reached Spain in September 1522, the practical fact was undeniable. A fleet had sailed west from Europe. One ship had returned from the east. The Earth had been circled by sea. That return changed how Europeans understood distance. Before the voyage, the globe could be imagined, calculated, argued about, and drawn. After the voyage, it had been endured. The Pacific especially had revealed itself in a way no theory had fully prepared them for. It was far larger than many had expected. It was not a modest gap between the Americas and Asia. It was a vast ocean that could starve a fleet while remaining calm. That knowledge mattered because maps are not just pictures. They are tools for decisions. A wrong map can encourage a king, ruin a voyage, or make an ocean look friendly when it is in fact very, very large and not at all interested in helping. The expedition also changed the meaning of the Americas in European geography. The lands across the Atlantic were not simply obstacles near Asia, as some early hopes had suggested. They were part of a much larger arrangement of continents and seas. South America stretched far down toward cold and difficult waters. The passage through its southern end existed, but it was dangerous, slow, and remote. The strait that Magellan found became one of the great discoveries of the voyage. but it did not become an easy highway. It was a doorway, yes, but a doorway at the bottom of the world, guarded by weather, distance, and the very reasonable complaints of sailors who preferred warmer places. The commercial result was more complicated than the glory. The expedition did reach the Spice Islands by sailing west, and Victoria returned with cloves. The cargo was valuable enough to prove that the voyage had not been entirely ruinous in financial terms. But as a regular trade route, the Western Passage was not practical in the way Spain had hoped. It was too long, too dangerous, and too uncertain compared with other routes. A business plan that requires crossing the Pacific while starving and losing most of the fleet is usually not considered ideal, even by the very ambitious standards of 16th century empire. Still, the voyage gave Spain knowledge and prestige. It showed that a Spanish-backed expedition could reach Asia from the west. It strengthened claims, arguments, and ambitions in the ongoing rivalry with Portugal. It also sharpened the dispute over where the Spice Islands lay, under the old division of the world between the two crowns. The Treaty of Tordesillas had drawn a line across the Atlantic, but drawing a line around a globe is much easier in theory than in practice, when no one can measure longitude properly. The Magellan-Elcano voyage did not settle all of these arguments neatly. History, regrettably, rarely behaves like a tidy desk, but it forced rulers and mapmakers to think on a global scale with new seriousness. One of the great changes was psychological. After the circumnavigation, the world was no longer a set of separate maritime regions in the same way. The Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans could now be understood as connected roads around one planet. Not easy roads, not safe roads, not empty roads, but connected ones. This helped create the conditions for the first truly global age of sea travel, trade, conquest, mission, and exchange. Goods, people, animals, crops, diseases, silver, spices, ideas, violence, and information would move across oceans with increasing regularity. The voyage did not begin globalization by itself, but it became one of its clearest early signs. That is why the story cannot be treated only as a heroic adventure. It was a feat of navigation and endurance, yes. It was also part of European imperial expansion, with all the harm that expansion brought. The ships carried curiosity, but also weapons. They sought trade, but also control. They entered lands and waters already known to the people who lived there. They made alliances, misunderstood customs, used force, demanded submission, and sometimes treated human beings as things to be taken, converted, named, or displayed. A calm telling of the voyage should not turn away from that. The first circle around the world was made through other people's worlds. That matters. Along the coast of Brazil, in Patagonia, in Guam, in the Philippines, in Brunei, in the Moluccas, and elsewhere, the expedition encountered communities with their own knowledge and authority. The Europeans were not always the strongest people in the situation. Sometimes they needed food, sometimes they needed pilots, sometimes they needed permission, sometimes they used violence, sometimes they were defeated. Magellan himself died because he entered a local conflict and misjudged the power of the people he faced. The story looks very different when viewed from shore rather than from the deck. Lapu-Lapu's resistance at Mactan is one of the clearest examples. To the expedition, Mactan was the place where Magellan's leadership ended. To later Philippine memory, it became a symbol of local resistance to foreign power. Both meanings are part of the history, but they are not the same. A European commander died. A local leader refused to submit. A battle that may have seemed like a tactical decision to Magellan became, over time, something much larger in the memory of others. This is how history often works. Events do not keep only the meaning their participants first gave them. The voyage also changed the lives of people whose names are not usually placed at the centre. Sailors, servants, enslaved people, interpreters, pilots, carpenters, gunners, caulkers, cooks, and local guides all helped make the voyage possible. Some are known only from lists. Some appear briefly in accounts and then vanish. Some were left behind, captured, killed, or absorbed into other places. Enrique of Malacca remains one of the most important and mysterious figures in this regard. His language skills helped the expedition communicate in Southeast Asia. His own forced journey may have brought him around the world in a way the records do not fully honour. Because the main accounts were written from European positions of power, much of his experience remains hidden. That silence is part of the story too. Antonio Pigafetta's account gave the voyage much of its lasting shape. Without him, we would know far less about the daily suffering, encounters, ceremonies and battles. But his account, like all accounts, has a point of view. He observed carefully, but he also misunderstood. He recorded details, but he did not record everything. He wrote as a European gentleman of his time, with the assumptions that came with that world. Reading him is valuable, but not the same as seeing the voyage from every side. It is more like looking through one good window in a very large house. Elcano's achievement, meanwhile, deserves its own careful place. He did not plan the voyage as Magellan did. He did not find the strait. He did not command the fleet through the Pacific, but he brought Victoria home. That final act required judgment, nerve, and endurance. He chose to continue west when the expedition could no longer simply follow Magellan's command. He crossed the Indian Ocean while avoiding Portuguese ports. He rounded the Cape of Good Hope. He risked the stop at Cape Verde and escaped when the danger became clear. Without Elcano, the expedition might have reached the Spice Islands and still failed to complete the circle. Magellan and Elcano therefore stand in a strange partnership across time. Magellan opened the route, crossed the Pacific, and carried the expedition farther than any European commander had gone by sailing west. Elcano finished the return and made the circumnavigation real. One began the achievement and died before seeing the original goal. The other inherited a broken mission and brought the last ship home. It is not necessary to make one smaller in order to make the other visible. The voyage was large enough and costly enough to hold both names. For the survivors, the return must have been difficult to explain. How does a person describe 3 years at sea to someone who's been living on land the whole time? How do you speak of the Pacific hunger without making it sound like exaggeration? How do you describe the strait, the fires of Tierra del Fuego, the death of Magellan, the smell of cloves in the hold, the missing day at Cape Verde, and the feeling of seeing Spain again? A listener might nod, impressed, and still not understand. Some experiences become smaller when spoken aloud because language has to carry them one sentence at a time. Imagine one of the 18 original survivors walking through Seville after returning. His body is weaker than when he left. His face is older. His clothes are worn. He has seen stars in another sky, people in distant islands, water wider than anyone around him can picture, and enough death to last several lifetimes. Around him the city continues, markets open, bells ring. People argue over prices, someone is late for an appointment, someone complains about bread. Ordinary life resumes, as it always does, with a confidence that can feel almost rude to those who have barely survived. The world has changed, and yet the street still needs sweeping. That too is part of great history. After the event, people still have to eat supper. The Magellan-Elcano expedition also reminds us that discovery is often a word needing careful handling. Europeans discovered routes and places for European maps, but they did not bring existence to the lands they reached. The strait was new to them, not to the world. The islands were new to them, not to the people who lived there. The Pacific was uncrossed by Europeans in that direction, but it was not an empty sea without human knowledge. Pacific Islanders had long traditions of navigation, and communities across island Southeast Asia were deeply connected by maritime skill. To say the expedition changed European knowledge is accurate. To say it discovered the world as though the world had been waiting in darkness would be wrong. What it did do was join separate bodies of knowledge into a new European framework. Reports from the voyage helped map makers redraw coastlines, adjust distances, and rethink the planet's scale. It gave rulers information useful for empire. It gave merchants a clearer, if sobering, sense of possible routes. It gave writers material for wonder. It gave later historians a story that could be told as bravery, tragedy, conquest, science, greed, endurance, or all of these together. And perhaps that is why the voyage still holds our attention. It refuses to be one thing. It is a story of courage. Men sailed into waters they did not understand and kept going through hunger, cold, mutiny, and fear. It is a story of ambition. Kings and merchants sought wealth, power, and advantage across a world already full of people. It is a story of knowledge. The expedition proved the practical connection of the oceans and showed the immense scale of the Pacific. It is a story of suffering. Most of the men who left did not return. It is a story of violence. The fleet's encounters with local peoples were not innocent or harmless. It is a story of survival. One small ship came home. Holding all those truths together is more honest than choosing only one. By the time Victoria returned, the age of oceanic empire was already underway. The voyage did not create that age, but it gave it a new horizon. Spain would build routes across the Pacific later, especially between the Americas and the Philippines. The Americas would become tied to Asia through silver, trade, and colonial rule. The movement of goods across oceans would accelerate. European powers would compete more fiercely across the globe. The first circumnavigation was not only the closing of a route, it was the opening of a more connected and more dangerous world. For science and geography, the voyage offered something precious, measured experience, not perfect measurement, not modern precision, but lived evidence. It showed the great width of the Pacific. It revealed the difficulty of southern navigation. It confirmed that a ship could sail west and return from the east. It exposed the problem of the missing day, a practical sign of circling the globe. It strengthened the understanding that time, place and travel around a rotating Earth had consequences even for a sailor's calendar. Imagine surviving hunger, storms and imperial politics, only to discover that your diary is off by a day. The planet has a quiet sense of humour, though perhaps not always a kind one. There is also a more personal lesson in the voyage, though not a soft or simple one. The men who completed the circle did not do so because everything went according to plan. Almost nothing went according to plan. Ships were lost, leaders died, routes were misunderstood, supplies failed, alliances collapsed. The final success came through adaptation after disaster. It was not a clean triumph, but a battered continuation. That may be one reason the story feels so human. Few lives move in straight lines. Most of us, thankfully, do not have to round the Cape of Good Hope in a leaking ship full of cloves, but we do know something about plans changing, confidence failing, and the need to keep moving with whatever remains. The final image of the voyage is not 5 ships leaving in hope, but one ship returning in proof. Victoria was small, damaged, and exhausted. She carried cloves, records, survivors, and the shape of a new understanding. She also carried absence, the absence of Magellan, the absence of the Santiago, San Antonio, Concepcion and Trinidad, the absence of the men buried at sea, killed on beaches, detained in foreign ports, or lost to sickness and hunger. Every achievement has a shadow made from its cost, and this one had a long shadow. So when we remember the first circumnavigation, it is worth imagining both the map and the deck. The map shows the line around the world. The deck shows the men who paid for every mile. The map is clean, the deck is not. The map makes the voyage look inevitable. The deck reminds us that it was never guaranteed. The map says around the world. The deck says one more watch, one more repair, one more mouthful, one more decision, one more day. And now, after following them from Spain to South America, through the Strait, across the Pacific, into the Philippines, onto the Spice Islands, across the Indian Ocean, around Africa, and back to Spain, we can let the ship rest in harbour for a while. The voyage began with a dream of spices and a question about distance. It ended by changing the scale of the world in the minds of those who heard the story. The Earth was not smaller after Victoria returned. If anything, it was larger, because now its vastness had been proven by hunger, sailing, and time. The oceans were connected, the continents stood in new relation. The old trade dreams remained, but the price of reaching them was clearer, and somewhere in that long return is a quiet thought worth keeping. People often speak of going around the world as if the phrase itself is light. Today, aircraft cross oceans in hours, messages travel instantly, maps sit folded inside our phones, patiently correcting us when we miss a turn. But once, going around the world meant trusting wood, wind, stars, and the strength of men who could not know whether the next horizon would bring land or only more water. So, wherever you are listening from tonight, near the sea or far from it, in a bright city or a quiet room, perhaps this old voyage can settle gently into the background of your thoughts. 5 ships left, 1 returned, the world was circled. And between those facts lies one of the most difficult journeys human beings had ever made. If this story brought you a little calm, a little curiosity, or simply a long path to follow while the day loosened its grip, I would be grateful if you gave the video a like and subscribed. It helps this quiet space reach other travellers of thought, the kind who enjoy old maps, distant harbours, and stories that move slowly enough to breathe. For now the sails are lowered. The harbour is still. The men who survived have stepped onto land, and the last ship rests after carrying the first completed circle around the earth. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever in the world you are, and may your own night be far softer than the sea they crossed.